Okay, so this is going to sound a little crazy. I'm going to admit it right off the top. I'm going to see if some people come and join, but here's why I'm going to talk about this. So I'm going to let people come in a little bit. And please share and listen. This is probably going to sound, to some of you, if not a lot of you, pretty cuckoo. But bear with me here. The people that I'm really trying to talk to are those of you who are more artistic and poetic, and let me just say it this way. I like to say that the literalists will literally kill us all. But I'm really struck by something. You know, there's a lot of talk about how we need new mythology out there. But let me give you a little background first for those who don't know. So, my mother is Hungarian, and her father was Austrian nobility, and were Jews. And she was born in Hungary, and so in 44, with the rise of the Arrow Cross, Hungarian Jews were suddenly no longer safe. And it's actually not really known by many people that under the Habsburgs, Jews were actually free to own land and more. Now, I find this interesting because there's a lot of, and I can show you these primary documents to prove this, but in 1923, the Internationale that met, that were discussing what was going on with communism. This is sort of the big, this is like the Bolshevik version of, I don't know, Burning Man. They all got together and they were calling, in 1923, World War I, the first war against imperialism. I find that a little interesting. But what struck me, so look, I don't know Cernovich the man. I don't know. I'm talking about Cernovich, the persona, this influencer character that's online, and the guy's never rubbed me right. In fact, he's had me blocked for a while. I tried to look back to see why, but apparently he deleted the tweet. It had something to do with 9/11. I would assume that he was going off on some truther thing, but here's what I'm finding interesting right now. So this whole, people, like Tim Pool and all of those people thinking that what James Lindsay's talking about regarding this other variation on woke, that I firmly believe it is a mistake to actually talk about any of this on the left or the right. I think it's a massive mistake, and it always has been. And James and I have touched on this a little bit, but I admire the work he does very much, and he's been showing something that I don't think I really fully understood until maybe a few moments ago. I would often take umbrage with the claim that Marxism is purely a Gnostic thing, because as somebody who is an artist and is cosmopolitan, I like to keep a very wide, door. And I take a lot of umbrage with people who, for example, will point to art and say that is purely satanic, or that is purely an example of something very dark, because, well, frankly, it shows a lot of both ignorance and arrogance against what art is and what it isn't. And if we would use, say, Marina Brobovich's example, her audience is a very specific group of people whom we don't know if what she's doing there isn't actually showing them a reflection of what it is that they're doing. And our tendency to take it so literal and blame and claim that these artists are satanic is frankly pretty stupid, because I don't know about you, but I give the devil his due. I think it's I think it serves more as a distraction, as a spectacle, to point to something like that and say, oh, look, this is, devilish, but, meanwhile, sponsored by Pfizer. Nobody notices that. Anyway, something that has been going on with these performative sort of wokies that claim to be right influencers, or influencers in general on that side of things, they're reminding me sort of like, it's like we're watching the birth of sort of the Joy Reids of media. It's like, it's the same monster, just coming up in a new media kind of way. And I mean, I'll tell you, I worked at CNN. I quit in 2008. What people don't understand about people in media, generally, is how many freaking sociopaths there are. I mean, literal sociopaths. I mean, people who have no conscience and they have no sense of... I mean, imagine how empty that must feel. Really. And I mean, it's effective and, it can be very useful if you need somebody to be able to handle, say, surgery. That's why a certain percentage of sociopaths is very useful for society. But imagine if you are a sociopath and you have no sense of purpose, but you have a very almost mechanized approach to reality. Now, I said earlier that I think that maybe a lot of people who are on the spectrum are in fact sociopaths. And I'm not even necessarily saying this is all bad. I mean, I'm gonna come out and say a couple things that I've never said in public, but I think that some sociopaths actually, much like Dexter, can be trained to sort of modify their own weaknesses. And I say this because, frankly, I'm not so sure that the kind of chaotic neutral or even chaotic good guy that's allowed us to speak freely on this platform is necessarily on the spectrum. I kind of have a sense that he's probably more toward the other side because he can mimic. That mimicking thing we saw on SNL kind of was a dead giveaway to me. So why am I bringing this up? Well, because there seems to be this phenomenon going on where so many of the people who claim to be woke, or rather who seem to be propagating identitarianism in that really strange hierarchy of, oppressed, oppressor, and stuff like that, mimicking the woke we saw on the left, but denying it, and apparently being on what I guess we call the right, which I just keep calling Socrealism, because it's sociopathic realism, is what it is. It's not just socialist realism, it's a sociopathic realism, that everything is related to where your position is in a hierarchy, and that you, as a member of some society or in that hierarchical position, whether that is parallel or whatever to somebody else's, that you are unthinkable outside a collective. That is such a mechanized way of looking at the world. I mean, really, if you were to imagine, all the stories from Battlestar Galactica to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to even the mythic story of the Golem, this is the problem. This is either a soulless, free will-less, alive being, or something that's been trained into that. And what do I mean by trained into that? Well, the Pitești prison experiment was more than just a gulag in Romania. And in fact, Daryl Cooper talked about this in Anti-Humans. And I was pretty devastated to see Daryl go to the dark side, because this was the first time I'd ever heard anyone talk about Black Valley or Pitești, which is very much part of my family history. That's where my grandfather was taken to the Black Valley Gulag after they fled to Romania from Hungary in 1944. And my grandfather was a hussar, which means defender of the empire, and he was a Jew, and he was nobility, and very wealthy. He was building theaters and training Lipizzaner horses, or breeding them rather, to become... I mean, what do you do with a war horse once wars, if you're trying to stop that kind of war? I mean, if you sort of imagine the time leading up into World War I, it's very, in weird ways, similar to a bunch of people with, well, maybe a little bit less, but the inheritance of power without the confidence or the sense of, statesmanship or soulful purpose to go with it. So, I've always known my grandfather protested the beginning of World War I on the steps of Madison Square Garden in New York. He He dressed as a shoe shine guy and said, if we do this, we are going to be shining their shoes forever. And when you realize that the vanguard of the proletariat, just only within the Internationale, from the plenums of 1923, were calling World War I the first war against imperialism. I mean, that's a little strange, right? Or why so many people got angry at Trump for asking, hey, why did World War I even begin? Well, it's a damn good question. Why did it begin? And what did it leave behind, right? Well, I just made a tweet earlier where I said something that's not going to be for the literalists out there. Now, let me remind, I'm Jewish, and I'm the last of my family line. Like, I don't have children. I'm an only child on my mom's side. There are no more. I'm the last of my grandfathers, as Cernovich would like to talk about it, DNA. He gets very excited about DNA. You notice that? Well, in a way that only a eugenicist really could. But much respect, he actually did tweet out at one point that all of his books are like his sons. So, he's very, very focused on his legacy. But I'm going to tell you a little other tidbit about Noir. And look, I could be wrong here. But something is instinctually telling me that there's something to this. So in 2016, now this is embarrassing. It's embarrassing. Now, understand, I worked in nightlife in New York. I was hired to bring the theater to a venue so that it would stop the overdoses. That was my thesis, and I was right. But I think I'm back. Good. I think that's how I know a little bit about the club kid culture. Not that I was one, but I was exposed to it. And sometimes, you know what? Art is not always pretty. It's not always something that I would recommend. And it's not always artifice either. But let me enter this way. Charles Bukowski, who is a Weimar-born poet, he was born in the Weimar Republic in Germany. His father was stationed there. And he came to the United States, moved to California, and was pretty, mocked for being a German and, bullied for it. And he didn't become a successful poet until very late in life. And in fact, in the 90s, feminists up and down were, chastising him as being this misogynist. And, I fell for it for a long time. And I didn't even realize how incredible a poet he was. But he also was very much somebody who, in that book, The Art of Not Giving a Fuck, they focus a lot on Bukowski because he was amazing. He managed to, for example, get out of working as a postal worker. He never fell for the sort of ultimate sense of being, a Socrealist victim. But he was a sad guy, and he embraced getting drunk. And he was sort of there was a freedom in his, like, fuck this shit. There was something very New York about this Californian. But anyway, he wrote an exceptional poem. And it's called The Genius of the Crowd. And I want to share this with you first, and keep this in mind, because he really had a knack for kind of getting the flavor, like almost like how a chef can, there's a difference between a cook and a chef, right? The art of cooking is, you can be a good, decent cook, you can make a good meatloaf, but not everybody's a chef. So the way he was masterful about chefing this poem that is about what totalitarianism really is, I want to share with you, and then I'll go on from there, because, like I said, to understand this in a literalist way, to try to peer review this, I don't think can be done. And to give away a little bit what I'm trying to get at is that, look, when you're dealing with something that is like a dark magic, I mean, and listen, there's an ordinariness to magic. It's not like, doing things to, I don't know, like those transhumanist wackos do. But the reason there's an art to these things. I mean, art, science, they all can come across as magical. There's nothing wrong with that. Not everything has to be understood and known. And then when you discover something that previously seemed unknown, it can feel magical. But if you stop there and think you then know everything, that's where you have a bit of a problem. But that's where I think the Gnostics kind of went wrong. This belief that you can know everything, or that even that's a good thing. I mean, hasn't anyone read Genesis? There's the lesson there to me is that there's something non-dualistic about both knowing and not knowing at the same time. And the non-dual nature, really, of God being of everything and in everything, and is kind of inherent in that. But you can even see that in relationships, right? You know, in a husband and a wife, or, you know, friendship and kinship. There's a knowing and a not knowing. And, you know, Rilke called this, that's what love consisted in, that love consists in this, that two solitudes meet, greet, and protect each other, so that we're always alone on some level. But imagine if there's this really kind of juvenile, almost machine-like, you know, it's instead of like in Wizard of Oz, you know, if I only had a brain or only had a heart, if I only had a soul, right? This denial of free will and the responsibility inherent in that, almost like a return back to pre-Exodus, to that level of real enslavement. So Bukowski had this to say. He said, in The Genius of the Crowd, he said, there is enough treachery, violence, absurdity in the average human being to supply any given army on any given day. And the best at war are those who preach against it. And the best at hate are those who preach love. And the best at war, finally, are those who preach peace. Those who preach God need God. Those who preach peace do not have peace. Those who preach love do not have love. Beware the preachers. Beware the knowers. Beware those who are always reading books. Beware those who detest poverty or are proud of it. Beware those who need constant crowds, for they are nothing alone. Beware the average man, the average woman. Beware their love. Their love is average, seeks average, but there is genius in their hatred. There is enough genius in their hatred to kill you, to kill anybody. Not wanting solitude, not understanding solitude. They will attempt to destroy anything that differs from their own. Unable to create art, they will not understand art. They will see their failure as creators only as the failure of the world. Unable to love fully, they will see your love as incomplete. And then they will hate you. And their hatred will be perfect. Like a shining diamond, like a knife, like hemlock, like a tiger. Their finest art. I think that poem encapsulates so brilliantly what we've been dealing with, especially this whole idea of the genius of the crowd, this sort of democratic way, odd democratic way of determining what is true and what isn't true. And I dare say that there's something odd about seeing people like Cernovich talk about ayahuasca. Because I was drugged with it. Against my will. So I'm kind of like a weird science, what's it called? I forget the term, but I didn't choose it. I didn't go looking for it. I didn't even know I was on it. I mean, that wasn't it was terrible. I mean, it was just really traumatic. It was something I wasn't able to talk about for a very long time. But what I can tell you, as somebody who also practiced Buddhism for a very long time, meditated for a long time, have had a relationship to God for a long time, as long as I can remember. I'm spiritual, a little wacky. It is a very enticing experience. and it's a very harrowing one. So it's pretty good at making it seem like you are, in fact, just by going through it, going through a rite of passage, or a ritual of something that harkens way back to this need, especially amongst men, to go through a period to so you become a man, right? You've heard there's a problem with this, for women. We suddenly bleed, right? There's certain things that happen that it's unmistakable, but what makes a man? But this can feel very harrowing. You have the whole going into the, with the shaman and blah, 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 blah. Well, I'll just tell you that I'm not saying that these drugs don't necessarily have some good things that can come from them. Listen, I'm fully on board with people who, like somebody like me, I have CRPS. I am probably going to be looking into some ketamine treatment for this pain, and also for even grief support, because I just went through a hellish experience with these storms and leaving New York and blah, a lot. But have you noticed that there's this strange, almost like catechism, almost holy way that some drugs get elevated into the status of, like a golden calf, really. Ayahuasca is one of these. Now, I know that there's a variation on this, the ibogaine, which can be used to help people, overcome addiction. So, look, even, Botox can be great for migraines, and also, I've never had it, but, it would be maybe nice to get rid of some of these. But it can also, in another form, kill you. But so can water. The problem I have with ayahuasca is the mythology around it. And what do I mean by that? Well, I remember when ayahuasca started getting a lot of traction, mostly surrounding Burning Man. Now, I trained in experimental theater at Tisch at NYU. That meant that, did a lot of studies on ritual theater, physicality, all that good stuff. Not your traditional, it's not when you sit and think about what is a theater education or what is that all about, most people won't think of the training that I had. It's very different than, we didn't sit there and imagine, I have to think about when my mom hit me, therefore, to play this part. No, that's psychological torture. I'm really not my bag. And I'm very opposed to it. And I discuss this a lot in my thread on the dancing nurses, if you want to check that out. So I'm going to jump away. But Meyerhold was sort of the root of my lineage. And I practiced Buddhism. And that really brought me back to Judaism and sort of an understanding of a lot of things that we lost along the way. Hate to tell, it's kind of, probably shouldn't say this out loud, but Judeo-Christianity is kind of a misnomer. We have more in common with Hindus and Native Americans, because it's we're very shamanic people. But we also wanted to survive. So a lot of that was, hidden away. And, just when we are, saying, hey, don't blame us for deicide, suddenly me saying that we're not exactly, totally connected, that simple. But but spiritually speaking, our relationship to God is very unique. And again, human beings are ritual makers. This is something we will do. We do it. When there's an absence of ritual, we seek it out. So if you notice during COVID, when everything was shut down, putting on a mask really became a ritual. I made a joke about it, I was putting on Biden, Fauci, Build Back Better, it's all of it really, the whole COVID fiasco felt very ritualized. But there's a lot of ritual out there. And right now, politics has replaced almost all ritual. There's so much political ritual that we don't even recognize it as much, but it has a power to it. It has a way of communicating something, both intergenerationally and without language. And I was very interested in Burning Man when I was training, because when it was created, it's a phenomenally bold ritual. It's a phenomenally bold piece of theater, to be frank, or interactive theater is really what I would call it. It's very much so. Now, truth be told, I have not been able to go because, unfortunately, I have migraines. So I never, the one time in 2008 that I was supposed to go with a boyfriend who had an RV, I didn't go. But it's just a lot of stuff nowadays you have to do to just get there. It's very expensive. I would love to be a kind of fly on the wall of Burning Man. But as somebody with this background, getting all dolled up and dressed up and, like I said, I brought the theater to a venue for, nightlife. I don't really feel... I can understand why a lot of people would feel this incredible draw to this period where you can kind of have this liminal time, this space and this time out of time, that you can kind of go into this Dionysian sort of playground and then come back. Or even more, that you can build something, then destroy it and be okay. Kind of like a mandala. In Buddhism, that's one of the things you do, this idea of the way that everything is impermanent. Now, there's truth in that. And this finding of bliss in that is absolutely true. But what I would dare say is that the Abrahamic, faith that, because Buddhism is a spin-off of, we all share a very similar root. What Judaism did as it went forward and after Mount Sinai was it added an element that isn't in Buddhism, which is this, okay, you have bliss, now what? Like, bliss isn't enough. It's not. That you can feel there's so much joy, but it's not enough. There's something more. You have to choose more. Well, ayahuasca... So if you sit and you do a meditative practice, there's one, for example, in the practice that I did in Dzogchen called Trekshut, where it's an eye-open meditation, and you sit and you do it for hours and hours, and it's if you do a lot of this, and if you're in a retreat, you can enter into this state that really feels that sort of falsehood of duality melts away. I'm sure there's moments you felt this, but it's a profound experience. And, add into it the smells and the sounds and all of that. And it's what ritual can do. It's a lot of what I think even in Catholicism you see in the rituals surrounding communion, or even the term communion. But ayahuasca is kind of like this, it gives you this feeling, kind of the way MDMA gives you a false feeling of empathy. Because when you realize it's not real, it kind of doesn't work quite. So you just, you get the emotions and all of that, but it's sort of like giving yourself a, I would dare say that anybody would argue that a orgasm created in a lab is not the same thing as making love. It's similar to that phenomenon. So when I was drugged with it, and the intention was to hurt me, and that was pretty crazy. Not fun. But I did find it ultimately actually a little bit handy going into COVID, because there was moments that I said, God, this feels like an ayahuasca trip. And what do I mean by that? So on ayahuasca, it's not like taking mushrooms, or I've never done acid, but reality vanishes. So it's not like you on some level know that you're tripping. I mean, like I said, I've never done acid, but it's completely gone. And because I didn't know, the reality that I was experiencing, I thought was real. And boy, oh boy, did I wonder what the hell happened. Like, why would this be real? And my experience was pretty dark in many ways. I mean, I died over and over and over again, but there was also some interesting moments. But one of the things that really struck me early on, and in retrospect when I remembered the experience, was there's this moment where it really feels like you're, in my case, it felt like I was kind of like in bed knobs and broomsticks, sitting on this like mattress, like flying through the universe and approaching this singularity where I was suddenly aware that I was the one, or I was one of the chosen ones. And I think because of my Buddhist practice, this actually really pissed me off. I was like, I don't want that. It's not true. I don't like it. And that really did send me on a tailspin where the trip became pretty dark after that. Remarkably so. But I think that's telling. Because what I think people keep describing as ego death that comes out of ayahuasca is in fact what Chögyam Trungpa called the spiritual materialism, or how the ego can use anything for its own purposes. The form of ego death that people describe coming out of ayahuasca reminds me more of the falsehood of the collective of liberation theology. That's a key, I think. And you suddenly enter through this like you become almost anointed into this because you've gone through this shared journey or trial. I mean, it's a tough drug to take. This sense that you are suddenly a vanguard or an elite. And I don't think it's by accident that a lot of the craziness that came out of the woke world really was birthed out of the last few years of Burning Man post the rise of social media. Because once, I mean, kind of like, ladies, all that when if you're getting married and all this obsession sort of nowadays with how the Instagramming your wedding and all this. I mean, it's turning any ritual into that level of spectacle takes away from it the intimacy of the experience and turns it into a spectacle and reduces it into what I think is described in Genius of the Crowd by Bukowski. Now, I'm mentioning this only because I'm really struck when people like to proclaim their sort of ancestral DNA as being some sort of form of proof that they are, the chosen ones here to do something, let's just put it this way. Messianic belief like that just doesn't go well. I mean, look at Soros. By the way, Soros in Hungarian means full of shit. So I kind of have my question mark about what either his dad was not really Hungarian, or maybe it's like a big old punk, or I don't know. Hungarians are weird, and I am one, so I'm saying it. Yeah, we're weird. But sorry, half Hungarian. My mom is Hungarian. But here's the thing. It makes sense to me that when you're dealing with a mission of, say, let's say we're, take it away from all this hocus pocus stuff for a second. Or weird, I'm not even going to label it as Gnostic. I think the labels actually do us a disservice here. But let's say you are Mao. Okay. And Mao is a poet. He was a poet. His whole life was a dancer. He looked at these things through a very specific lens. A lot of his poetry is pretty severe and spooky, but he scares me because he really had an ability to understand certain things about linguistics, but also, there's something very telling about how we still to this day can't really keep talking about the rise of Maoism in America and what it really looks like. Because my theory, not only that these things are Socrealist, but what they are is Maoist. And this right-left paradigm in Maoism this understanding of a non-dualism is much, much, much more ingrained in the people, but also that birth. And I'm not saying that the Chinese people are all Maoists, because they're not, any more than all Georgians are Stalinists or all Austrians are Hitler. But there's something in the language, and a lot of people don't know this, but when the EU, for example, was, and I know it feels like I'm bouncing around a lot here, but just listen to this again if you can, but just try to follow the essence of what I'm saying, because it's very difficult in this environment where we are so focused on, forget credentialism, but sort of this way of left hemisphere way of approaching everything. That there's nothing. Listen, it's no surprise to me that Cernovich was advocating for the vaccine early on, saying, why would you not trust your doctor on this? And I'm not using him as an example, like, exclusively. I don't know the man. To me, he's really more of a character. He's created a kind of a character for himself. But it's a characteristic of this new media, this response to the oppressive censorship and censorial nature that was coming out of the, response to populism. But us not recognizing that that's what this is, or recognizing how a Maoist would take advantage of this and why. So, for one thing, Maoism is a lot closer to National Socialism in many, 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 many ways than it is to Bolshevism. But it utilizes Bolshevist, what they've learned, or what they learned. Just like I've heard people say, we're living in the results of the Pest prison experiment right now. And what does that mean? Basically, it was an experiment that was trying to prove that human beings can be reduced to essentially anything else in nature, just reactive meat sacks or useful eaters. Stuff you would see in sort of a Pavlovian experiment. And it was torture. It was horrible. And one of the worst things I've ever heard. I mean, if you put a gun in my head and said you can go to Auschwitz or Pest, I'm going straight to Auschwitz, because they are worse things than death. But the fact that we don't even know this, and that, what I keep calling a war on memory, is very Maoist. I mean, Stalin began it, and so did, the final solution. I mean, at the end of the day, do you really think racism and just a phobia of what somebody looks like motivates that level of passionate need to destroy something? I mean, I think there's lessons we got from COVID and the whole anti-vax or, Biden's dark winter of death phenomenon that we all went through that applies here. And it's an important lesson, which is that there's something a lot more than simply there are certainly people out there who are bullying 12, 13-year-olds who never grew out of just their superficial bigotry or their distaste for something. But there's also people who've never grown into their distaste for anything, or their ability to say that they have a preference. It's just very juvenile. It's very mechanized. It's very out of touch with something that's deeper. And that's okay, because we need all kinds, Hashem made all kinds. But if we keep looking at this through a partenost, or party spirit, or ideological spirit only, or class consciousness only, we are fading ourselves to sort of going backwards into this thing where basically being ruled by a bunch of people with either educated past their capacity or the mediocrity that Bukowski talks about. And don't get me wrong, I'm mediocre in a lot of things, tons of things. But I'm struck particularly, not so much by the people who seem to be the leaders in this influencer culture on this, whatever we're calling worker, but the passionate intensity of the people who are not just bots, but really finding a purpose in this. See, that's where the danger lies. And that's where I think the real up lies. Like, it's not the monsters, but it's the people who deliver the monsters their prey. Like, the people who train the monsters. I mean, they're the really bad ones. Like, it's not the Weinsteins. It's the CAAs. It's the people who delivered the women to Weinstein or kept enabling it, because nobody ever deals with them, because they are wonderfully out of, I think they're the they that my grandfather was referring to when he said we will be shining their shoes forever. That's the there. That's who he was talking about. Because what they are sociopathically good at is a form of menticide, or mental just rape of the mind, which is much, 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 much more dangerous than simple killing. And it also does a lot more to the person who is, I believe, behaving incredibly hypocritically. I mean, you keep going deeper and deeper into this. I mean, if I was Sternfish, I wouldn't know how to undo it, because he's not a stupid guy, and he's admirable in many, many ways for many of the things he's done. But this one thing, I'll tell you, I feel like that's sort of where the ayahuasca thing went wrong. Same thing like how LSD was used to torture people by the CIA. My sense is that's what ayahuasca was used for. And this is where it's going to get real wacky. But after I'd been drugged and there was nobody to really talk to about it, I would try to tell people this happened to me, and everyone was, at the time it was, ayahuasca was all the rage. I mean, there was articles like the drug for the kale generation. Everybody was, ayahuasca is so wonderful. It's a love drug. It's going to change your life. Da, da, da. I couldn't find anyone to talk to that would talk about how it can be dangerous, which is your first clue, especially if you come from a world that had a lot of drug culture like I did. Let me put it like this. The club kids and the deterioration of look, not everything that's not Puritan is terrible, and not everything should be libertine either. Like liberty, if it's overdone, goes into libertine, which has nothing to do with liberty at all. So it's, kind of like, well, Botox, I guess. Everything overdone is overdone. But if you're not exposed to this stuff, and if you don't come from a world where you've seen a lot of this, I mean, the first time you experience being up all night, dancing sober, just on this natural high, and this feeling of just collaborative joy with other people, kind of like that scene in Matrix when they're dancing to Zion, that whole thing. Yeah, that stuff. If you've never experienced it, it can become just as addictive as anything else. And I went through hell. I mean, I nearly died. And in my perception, I did over and over again for a very long time, and I needed major trauma therapy for it. I mean, it was horrifying what I went through, and also some little wacky parts too. But I couldn't find anybody who could talk about it, the negative side. And I kept looking and looking because I needed somebody to talk to, and I finally found the whole story about the creation of ayahuasca comes from this whole idea in Peru. There were the Jaguar tribe the shamans would lead their people on this ayahuasca trip to, give them insights. Well, that's a load of freaking baloney. Never happened. There was, for anybody who finds this, I can't remember the name of them right now. There's Kogi, I think it's Kogi tribe, are the ones who put the gold strands in the rainforest, in South America. Well, they've been often misunderstood, and I spoke to one of the leaders as well as what their tribal leader about this, because they are incredibly opposed to the use of ayahuasca. And I had found one site where they were talking about this, where they were saying it's incredibly dangerous. And no, the shamans did not take it. Basically, why would you take your people on this really it's almost like saying, hey, family, let's all take acid and learn a lot about each other. Wait, no. That's crazy talk. That's juvenile druggy talk. That's not even what Burning Man was originally founded on. That's not the radical self-reliance that it was founded on, the idea that it was created on. It was co-opted eventually by a bunch of, well, frankly, socialists. You trying to build and create this permanent thing and becoming woke and all that stuff. And if you notice, during COVID, one of the interesting things was that people couldn't go to Burning Man that year. And suddenly some formerly cuckoo, billionaires and millionaires kind of seemed to break out of a spell that they were in. You notice that? I know I did. It was pretty interesting. Well, the truth is that they found ayahuasca, for example, when they recently discovered a mass grave not too far from where the Aztecs were. Now, the Aztecs, they were pretty funky. They were sacrificing their own for a debt to the gods. And this was kind of, I guess you can call it whitewashed by a lot of artists, and plays like The Fifth Sun and things like that tried to make it seem like Christians had come in and not understood this It's basically this whole idea of tribal land, oppressor, blah, 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 all that stuff. I don't even have to get into it. But they found, for example, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe 3, a mass grave of children and baby llamas, all sacrificed together at one time, like 500 of them. And there was this ridiculous article in, I think it was Nat Geo, trying to say that all these kids were sacrificed for climate change. Yeah, that makes sense. Your entire survival is at risk, so therefore what are you going to do? Kill your kids? No. Don't be stupid. That's freaking stupid. This was such a massive brainwashing of the people believing they had a carbon debt that they would kill their own kids. It was Jonestown, the OG Jonestown. It's sick. And guess what they found that was inside these kids? Ayahuasca. That's right. I remember hearing a few years ago at a Burning Man that one guy had gotten drugged with ayahuasca and ran into the fire. And a lot of people who had been at Burning Man were really upset that people are like, don't ruin my burn. Look, I got that. Because had that been me, I would have run into the fire. I'm not saying that anybody is permanently screwed up by having taken this drug or that nobody can handle this. That's not what I'm saying. I'm very libertarian about this. But what I am saying is when someone is trying to tell you that ayahuasca can save the world and that they are chosen somehow, and then being so massively offended when you point to a fallacy in their own ideology, which is exactly what James did. Pointed out how this stuff is ideologically dangerously, so dangerously close to what led to not only the green shirts in Hungary, but Maoism. It's Maoism, people. That's what it is. The woke right, what do you want to call it? It's Maoism. We can even say it's like Stalinism versus Maoism all over again. And I want to share, to close this off, an introduction to the book, the Black Book of Communism. Now, no, I am not calling Cernovich a Maoist any more than I'm calling somebody who, who did one. Look, we are not simply what we believe. I mean, Emerson, Emersonian self-reliance. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by statesmen, philosophers, and divines. Change your mind. You are not your ideology. That's what individualism is all about. And frankly, if you really are of whatever noble breeding, you'd know this already. Come on. Wake up. Stop it. But I think that what is confusing to people is that we don't have sort of a, like, how can you simultaneously have an understanding of what it means to be noble or to be given a duty or test if you don't understand what it means to be courageous or what a hero is? I mean, look, the same person telling you that, there's someone given this duty to fight off communism, blah, 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 much like this is what the green shirts believed. It's the same person who was saying that after Perry, was arrested, that it would be DNA suicide for any man in New York City to protect women and children. What? I mean, if your entire worry about being your manhood is whether or not you're going to leave your seed behind, that's not a man. That's not a hero. I mean, that's not the trope of what a hero, like, that's not what the stories are. That's not what any of the lessons are. That's a very mechanized, sociopathic, and animalistic way of looking at humanity. A man's sole purpose is not just to leave their seed behind. It's not. Any more than my sole purpose is to leave mine. And don't get me wrong, It would have been very fulfilling, I'm sure, to get to be a mom, and I would have loved to have been. But it's these damn Maoists that made it impossible for me. So I'm a little pissed about it. So here's what I wanted to share with you from, let me see if I can get to it here. And I might actually have to read it from another account. So in the Black Book of the Black Book of Communism, they ask the question of why is it that we don't know what happened with communism the same way we understand what happened with, say, the Nazis and Stalin and Hitler. And I don't care, it's not about the numbers of dead. But if, in my not so humble opinion, we are actually very much dealing with the continuation of National Socialism with Maoism. And there's really no, even if they were on opposing sides, so to speak, and fighting each other, remember the old phrase, the left eats its own? Look, it's still a mechanized view of the world. It's still liberation theology. And we have to stop constantly needing to package everything into this, cowboys and Indians or, Western, overly simple way of looking at things. Now, sure, that works for many people and for a certain, way of telling these stories. But I dare say that in reality, it is not very useful to do that when it comes to... You're going to have to excuse me a second because I have to get the password for this Airbnb. 1 second. So I'm going to use my iPad to read this to you guys. And the Black Book of Communism is a fascinating book, but what I find the most fascinating is actually the introduction. And the reason I find it fascinating is that it talks about why something is not as understood or discussed. And I dare say that even though we keep talking about, Marxism and socialism and stuff, and there's more of awareness now, the way people are behaving, no. People still don't understand it. Totalitarian creep is totalitarian creep. It's rooted in liberation theology. It's all the same stuff. It's all the same problem. It's this falsehood that you are not born free. It's like a reversal of Exodus, right? Going back to being slaves under Pharaoh, but even Pharaoh was a slave under Pharaoh. So this is what Power of the Powerless understands, that everyone along the hierarchy is enslaved and a pillar of it. You, me, everybody. That means good news, bad news. You're essential. Good news. Bad news. You're also essential for the very thing that you wish wasn't around. Kind of like growing up. But what I think we need to understand, I think it's really risky to keep labeling the woke in sort of this binary over and over again. That works really well for, I guess, in some level, marketing and war, but it doesn't deal with the actual issue. And we've got a major issue because, it may not even be, appropriate to fully just call it Maoism, but this, what some people call globalist, or it is this Socrealist, sociopathic way of looking at reality, which says that you are unthinkable outside of a collective. Didn't we learn this from COVID? I mean, come on. We lived it, guys. Let's use it as a blessing, right? So, in the Black Book of Communism, here's what it says. Now, again, I am not trying to, attack in any way Cernovich the man, but this, kind of character that he's created, it's ridiculous. And I will add, though, look, I have a lot of respect for James Lindsay, and I consider him almost more like a friend in arms. We both been, fighting back against this for a while. And I remember when he was being accused of being an anti-Semite because he was warning Jews that, the rise of woke is going to lead to a backlash against us. And of course it would. But not for the reasons people think. But it's the same reason this war, like I said, it's war on memory. Even the whole, quote, Jew hate of coming out of Candace Owens, a lot of that, in my opinion, is to propagate a mythology that obfuscates the reality. I mean, Cernovich sounds a lot like a Sabbatean right now. I'm not saying he is, but the relationship the Sabbateans had with God is the problem. It's not what they were, it's how that relationship worked. And it's much like if you watch the short film that my mom's in, she explained that one of the reasons that communism was able to spread through Russia was because of the way that their relationship to God in Orthodoxy was very different than, say, in Catholicism or other forms of Christianity. This hierarchical, class-based, but also fear-based way of doing things, and this iconography allowed them to take the icons that were part of Russian Orthodoxy and then co-opt them into turning the iconography of Stalin, etc. We see it with the iconography of the woke or transformational gender crap of, it's basically cosmoism, which has really nothing to do with gender at all. It's another way of reducing people to a collective and reducing the individual, because the individual as an individual is the biggest threat to a mechanized view of the world, because it's life. I mean, the way nature works and its tendency to work towards the beautiful kind of chaos of each individual atom doing its own thing and then working in collaboration, so that weird non-dual thing, the machine doesn't get that. It's got to destroy it. And here's what this says. So, by Martin Malia, it's called The Forward, The Uses of Atrocity. Communism has been the great story of the 20th century, bursting into history from the most unlikely corner of Europe, amid the trauma of World War I. In the wake of the cataclysm of 1939 to 1945, it made a great leap westward in the middle of Germany, and an even greater one eastward to the China Seas. With this feat, the apogee of its fortunes, it had come to rule a third of mankind and seemed poised to advance indefinitely. For 7 decades, it haunted world politics, polarizing opinion between those who saw it as the socialist end of history and those who considered it history's most total tyranny. Guess which one I think it is. That's right. One might therefore expect the priority of modern historians would be to explain why communism's power grew for so long, only to collapse like a house of cards. But see, it didn't. Like I keep saying, it seemed to have, but we were ignoring Mao. I mean, that's a little bit because it's very easy to other something that feels so far away and different. It does. It's like a whole other world, right? Yet surprisingly, more than 80 years after 1917, probing examination of the big questions raised by the Marxist-Leninist phenomenon has hardly begun. Can the Black Book of Communism, recently a sensation in France and much of Europe, provide the salutary shock that will make a difference? Because a serious historiography was precluded in Soviet Russia by the regime's mandatory ideology. Scholarly, by the way, that mandatory ideology is Socrealism. Scholarly investigation of communism has until recently fallen disproportionately to Westerners. And though these outside observers could not entirely escape the ideological magnetic field emanating from their subject, in the half-century after World War II, they indeed accomplished an impressive amount. Even so, a basic problem remains: the conceptual poverty of the Western empirical effort. The poverty flows from the premise that communism can be understood in an aseptic and value-free mode as the pure product of social process. Accordingly, researchers have endlessly insisted that the October Revolution was a workers' revolt and not a party coup d'etat, when it was obviously the latter, riding piggyback on the former. Besides, the central issue in communist history is not the party's ephemeral worker base. It is what the intelligentsia victors of October later did with their permanent coup d'etat. And so far, this has been scarcely explored. More exactly, the matter has been obscured by two fantasies holding out the promise of a better Soviet socialism than the one the Bolsheviks actually built. The first is the Bukharin alternative to Stalin, a thesis that purports to offer a non-violent market road to socialism, that is, Marx's integral socialism, which necessitates the full suppression of private property, profit, and market. The second fantasy purports to find the impetus behind Stalin's revolution from above of 1929 to 1933 in a cultural revolution from below by party activists and workers against the bourgeois specialists dear to Bukharin, a revolution ultimately leading to massive upward mobility from the factory bench. Which such fables, now consigned to what Trotsky called the ash heap of history, perhaps a moral rather than a social approach to the communist phenomenon, can yield a truer understanding. For the much investigated Soviet social process, for the much investigated Soviet social process claimed victims on a scale that has never aroused a scholarly curiosity at all proportionate to the magnitude of the disaster. The Black Book offers us the first attempt to determine overall the actual magnitude of what occurred by systematically detailing Leninism's crimes, terror, and repression from Russia in 1917 to Afghanistan in 1989. This factual approach puts communism in what is, after all, its basic human perspective. For it was in truth a tragedy of planetary dimensions, in the French publisher's characterization, with a grand total of victims variously estimated by contributors to the volume at between 85 million and 100 million. Either way, the communist record offers the most colossal case of political carnage in history. And when this fact began to sink in with the French public, an apparently dry academic work became a publishing sensation, the focus of impassioned political and intellectual debate. The shocking dimensions of the communist tragedy, however, are hardly news to any serious student of 20th century history, at least when the different Leninist regimes are taken individually. The real news is that at this late date, the truth should come as such a shock to the public at large. To be sure, each major episode of the tragedy, Stalin's Gulag, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward and his Cultural Revolution, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge, had its moment of notoriety. But these horrors soon faded away into history. Nor did anyone trouble to add up the total and set it before the public. The surprising... Oops, what happened here? Apparently, Siri decided to shut it down on me here. A second. Or is it? All right. But these horrors soon faded away into history. Nor did anyone trouble to add up the total and set it before the public. The surprising size of this total, then, partly explains the shock the volume provoked. The full power of the shock, however, was delivered by the unavoidable comparison of this sum with that for Nazism, which, at an estimated 25 million, turns out to be distinctly less murderous than communism. And the volume's editor, Stéphanie Croteau, rather than letting the figures speak for themselves, spell out the comparison, thereby making the volume a firebrand. Now, I'm going to take a pause here, and I'm going to share with you something written by Rabbi Marvin Entelman. about that number. So, in this book called To Eliminate the Opiate, this is volume 2, written by a rabbi, discussing one of the core reasons why Jews are the subject of much attention, being that, much like the idea of the action being reaction, and I've said this before, we're not exactly the target. I mean, don't get me wrong, we are. I don't want us to, no. But there's more going on. We're a very useful tool towards something else. So, he says in page 182, he says, and this chapter is called The Holocaust, Sabbatean Burnt Offerings. Of course, it says, in the days of King David, the warning was ignored, as it states in 2 Samuel 24, when the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and David numbered the people directly rather than indirectly. The plague which afflicted the Israelites resulted in the death of 70,000 from Dan to Beersheba. What does this have to do with the Shoah? A.R. Butts wrote a book called The Hoax of the 20th Century, which attacks the fact that over 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Butts and his ilk throughout the world are a part of a group called Holocaust revisionists. However, great rabbinic philosophers have stated that anti-Semitic diatribes are a punishment of sorts, visited upon our people because we have neglected to do God's duty. Thus, when Jews abandoned the study of the Talmud, we were attacked as Talmudists. When we stormed the ghetto walls as they came tumbling down in Europe and were eager to assimilate into Gentile society, we were accused of being clannish. Applying their reasoning to this situation, we made a terrible mistake at the end of World War II by proclaiming the numbers. Our rabbis, with the exception of Homilitic stories, did not enter into body counts in the wake of the destruction of the first and second temples. More important than that, one does not find body counts in the book of Jeremiah or lamentations about the first temple destruction. Depending on certain catastrophic events, the Torah either remains silent on the body count, for example, the golden calf, or enumerates them, the 24,000 killed because of Zimri ben Salu having sexual intercourse with a pagan woman, Numbers 25. When Jews enter synagogue to make a quorum, we are not counted directly, but indirectly. A verse from Scripture is recited that has 10 words. The Jewish contribution to civilization and its role is that of a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Our people are measured qualitatively, not quantitatively. Perhaps one of the most eloquent descriptions of human impact on eternity by a poet is that of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Speaking of the qualitative contribution of humanity, he wrote, quote, "Departing, they leave behind them footprints on the sand of time." Nevertheless, the quantitative numbers are there, and during the week of the Shoah following Passover in Israel, there is a day called Yom HaShoah, which commemorates the murder of the Jews by the Nazis. For a whole week, 24 hours a day, 2 TV stations broadcasting the reading of 6 million plus names of victims who are known to have perished. This is a direct line between the Sufi and the Shoah. The word Holocaust is pejorative. It means burnt offering. And if one checks a dictionary prior to World War II, he would only find that one definition. David Zeitlin has inveighed against the term, and so have other historians who want to know who hung this word upon us. In the idolatrous ancient roots of the Sufi, one finds the deity Maklu worshipped in ancient Assyria with burnt offerings and witchcraft rite. Jacob Frank received financial remuneration from the Aga of the Sufi to aid him in the Frankist plans to exterminate Jews and Judaism in Bucharest, Romania on November 6, 1757. The practice among the Sabbateans when they circumcised their children was to burn the foreskins, according to a Sabbatean family member who wished to convert to Judaism through a rabbinic court. Present at the meeting were Rabbi Dubovik and Dr. G. Schlesinger. Interviews with the rabbinic court continued for several years thereafter. In respect to Sabbatean practices, the foreskin burning was called a kalil, burnt offering or holocaust, and represented the ultimate extermination of Israel. In the case of those Sabbateans who outwardly professed to be Jews, the child on the day of his circumcision was secretly baptized into Christianity. So, what I'm touching on here, again, is this idea of the power of ritual. So these numbers obfuscate the qualitative tragedy of what we're actually dealing with. So in my humble opinion too, it's very much, or not so humble, it's more akin to the Aztec human sacrifice that we know happened a long time ago, but seems to be inherently kind of in us. And I mean, heck, this is why we were told no human sacrifices. Isaac. These stories have a lot of meaning because I think it makes some strange sense in this sort of, one of the dangers of humanity is how difficult it can feel like that everything is both sacrificial and not. You know, being a human being is a complicated matter. I mean, goodness, it's been rough on me for the last few months. But again, to go back to the introduction of the Black Book of Communism. The full power of the shock, however, was delivered by the unavoidable comparison of this sum with that of Nazism, which at an estimated 25 million turns out to be distinctly less murderous than communism. And the volume's editor, Stéphane Courteau, rather than let the figures speak for themselves, spelled out the comparison, thereby making the volume a firebrand. Arguing from the fact that some Nuremberg jurisprudence has been incorporated into French law to accommodate such cases such as that of Maurice Papon, a former minister of the Giscard d'Estaing, tried in 1997 to 98 for complicity in deporting Jews while a local official of Vichy, Courteau explicitly equated the class genocide of communism with the race genocide of Nazism, and categorized both as crimes against humanity. What is more, he raised the question of the complicity with communist crime of the legions of Western apologists for Stalin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, and indeed Pol Pot, who, even when they abandoned their idols of yesteryear, did so discreetly and in silence. These issues have a special resonance in France. Since the 1930s, the left has been able to come to power only as a popular front of socialists and communists, whether under Leon Blum or Francois Mitterrand, a tandem in which the democratic partner was always compromised by its allies' allegiance to totalitarian Moscow. Conversely, since 1940, the right has been tainted by Vichy links with Nazism. Now, remember, the right-left paradigm comes from France, guys. Let it go. Please. It's part in Yost. Washington warned us. Spirit of party. The left party, the right party. It's gotta go. It's gotta go. Conversely, since 1940, the right has been tainted by Vichy's links with Nazism, the subject of the Papon affair. In such a historical context, knowing the truth about the USSR has never been an academic matter. Furthermore, it happens that at the time the volume appeared, the socialist prime minister Lionel Jospin stood in need of communist votes to assemble a parliamentary majority. Orders of the right, therefore, citing the Black Book, rose in the National Assembly to attack his government for harboring allies with an unrepented criminal past. Jospin countered by recalling the liberation coalition between Gaullists and communists, which was fair game, only the better to conclude that he was proud to govern with them too, which was a gaffe. For at the liberation, the Gulag was not yet known. Nor was this just a hasty choice of words. In the eyes of the left that he leads, the communists, despite their past errors, belong to the camp of democratic progress, whereas the right is open to suspicion of softness toward the national front of the fascist. Jean-Marie Le Pen, after all, the conservatives had once rallied to Vichy. The incident ended with the non-Gaullist right walking out of the chamber while the Gaullists remained awkwardly in place. Thereupon the debate spread to television and the press. Indeed, the debate divides the book's own authors. All research scholars associated with the Centre d'études de sociologie du communisme, I don't even know how to say it in French, communisme, sorry to my French friends, and its review, Communisme, founded by the pioneer of, they make it all seem far less scary than Germans, right? I mean, you say something in German, it's like, Achtung, you know? Sorry. trying to make light. Founded by the pioneer of academic communist studies, the late Annie Kriegel, its mission is to exploit our new access to Soviet archives in conjunction with younger Russian historians. Equally to the point, their researchers are former communists or close fellow travelers, and it is over the assessment of their common past that they divide. Thus, once the Black Book raised the foreseeable political storm, Courtois' two key collaborators, Nicholas Wirth for Russia and Jean-Louis Margolin for China, publicly disassociated themselves from his bolder conclusions. So, let us begin with the debate, which is hardly specific to France. It breaks out wherever the question of the moral equivalence of our 2 centuries, 2 totalitarianisms is raised. Indeed, wherever the very concept of totalitarianism is invoked. For Nazism's unique status as absolute evil is now so entrenched that any comparison with it easily appears suspect. On the several reasons for this assessment of Nazism, the most obvious is that the Western democracies fought World War II in a kind of global popular front against fascism. Moreover, whereas the Nazis occupied most of Europe, the communists during the Cold War menaced only from afar. Thus, although the stakes for democracy in the new conflict were as high as in its hot predecessor, the stress of waging it was significantly lower. And it ended with the last general secretary of the evil empire, Mikhail Gorbachev, in the camaraderie embrace of the ultimate Cold Warrior, President Ronald Reagan. Communism's fall, therefore, brought with it no Nuremberg trial, and hence no decommunization to solemnly put Leninism beyond the pale of civilization. And of course, there still exist communist regimes in international good standing. Another reason for our dual perception is that defeat cut down Nazism in the prime of its iniquity, thereby eternally fixing its full horror in the world's memory. By contrast, communism at the peak of its iniquity was rewarded with epic victory, and thereby gained a half-century in which to lose its dynamism, to half-repent of Stalin, and even, in the case of some unsuccessful leaders such as Czechoslovakia's Alexander Dubček in 1968, to attempt giving the system a human face. As a result of these contrasting endings of the 2 totalitarianisms, all Nazism's secrets were barred 50 years ago, whereas we are only beginning to explore Soviet archives, and those of East Asia and Cuba remain sealed. The effect of this unequal access to information was magnified by more subjective considerations. Nazism seemed all the more monstrous to Westerners for having arisen in the heart of civilized Europe, in the homeland of Luther, Kant, Goethe, Beethoven, and indeed Marx. Communism, by contrast, appeared as less of a historical aberration in the Russian borderland of Europe, almost Asia, after all, where, despite Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, civilization had never fully taken deep root. The ultimate distinguishing characteristic of Nazism, of course, is the Holocaust, considered as the historically unique crime of seeking the extermination of an entire people, a crime for which the term genocide was coined around the time of Nuremberg. And therewith the Jewish people acquired the solemn obligation to keep the memory of its martyrs alive in the conscience of the world. Even so, general awareness of the final solution was slow to emerge. In fact, coming only in the 1970s and 1980s, the very years when communism was gradually mellowing. So between these contrasting circumstances, by the time of communism's fall, the liberal world had had 50 years to settle into double standard regarding its 2 late adversaries. Accordingly, Hitler and Nazism were now a constant presence in Western print and on Western television, whereas Stalin and communism materialized only sporadically. The status of ex-communist carries with it no stigma, even when unaccompanied by an expression of regret. Past contact with Nazism, however, no matter how marginal or remote, confers an indelible stain. Thus, Martin Heidegger and Paul de Man have been enduringly compromised and the substance of their thought tainted. By contrast, Louis Aragon, for years under Stalin, the editor of the French Communist Party's literary magazine in 1996, was published among the classics of the Pléiade. The press was lyrical in praise of his art, while virtually mute about his politics. The Black Book reproduces a 1931 poem to the KGB's predecessor, the GPU. Likewise, the Stalinist poet and Nobel laureate Pablo Neruda, in the same year, was sentimentalized together with his cause by an acclaimed film, Il Postino, even though in 1939, as a Chilean diplomat in Spain, he acted as de facto agent of the Comintern, and in 1953 mourned Stalin with a fulsome ode. And this list of unparalleled lives could be extended indefinitely. Even more skewed is the situation in the East. No gulag camps have been turned into museums to commemorate their inmates. All were bulldozed into the ground during Khrushchev's de-Stalinization. The only memorial to Stalin's victims is a modest stone brought to Moscow from the Arctic camp of Solovki and placed in Lubyanka Square, though well off to the side, where the KGB's former headquarters still stands. Nor are there any regular visitors to this lonely slab. One must cross a stream of traffic to reach it. And no more than an occasional wilted bouquet. By contrast, Lenin's statue still dominates most city centers, and his mummy reposes honorably in its mausoleum. Throughout the former communist world, moreover, virtually none of its responsible officials have been put on trial or punished. Indeed, everywhere communist parties, though usually under new names, compete in politics. Thus, in Poland, Alexander Kwasniewski, one-time member of the General Jaruzelski's government in 1996, won the presidency against the symbol of resistance to communism, Lech Walesa, admittedly an inept campaigner. Gyula Horn, the Prime Minister of Hungary from 1994 to 1998, was a member of the country's last communist government and a member of the militia that helped suppress the 1956 revolt alongside the Soviet army. In neighboring Austria, by contrast, former President Kurt Waldheim was ostracized worldwide once his Nazi past was uncovered. Granted, card-carrying Western literati and later-day Eastern apparatchiki never served as executioners for Stalin. Even so, does the present silence about their past mean that communism was all that less bad than Nazism? The debate around the Black Book can help frame an answer. On the one side, commentators in the liberal Le Monde argue that it is illegitimate to speak of a single communist movement from Fontaine in Paris. Rather, the rampage of the Khmer Rouge is like the ethnic massacres of Third World Rwanda, or the rural communism of Asia is radically different from the urban communism of Europe, or Asian communism is really only anti-colonial nationalism. The subtext of such Eurocentric condensation is that conflating sociologically diverse movements is merely a stratagem to obtain a higher body count against communism, and thus against all the left. In answer, commentators in the conservative Le Figaro, spurning reductionist sociology as a device to expultuate communism, reply that Marxist-Leninist regimes are cast in the same ideological and organizational mold throughout the world. And this pertinent point also has its admonitory subtext that socialists of whatever stripe cannot be trusted to resist their ever-present demons on the far left. The popular fronts were no accident, after all. Yet, if we let the divided contributors to the Black Book arbitrate the dispute, we find no disagreement in this matter. The Leninist matrix indeed served for all the one's fraternal parties. To be sure, the model was applied differently in different cultural settings. As Margolin points out, the chief agent of repression in Russia was a specially created political police, the Cheka GPU NKVD KGB, while in China it was the People's Liberation Army, and in Cambodia it was gun-toting adolescents from the countryside. Thus, popular ideological mobilization went deeper in Asia than in Russia. Still, everywhere the aim was to repress enemies of the people, like noxious insects. As Lenin said early on, thus inaugurating communism's animalization of its adversaries. Moreover, the line of inheritance from Stalin to Mao to Ho to Kim Il-sung to Pol Pot was quite clear, with each new leader receiving both material aid and ideological inspiration from his predecessor. And to come full circle, Pol Pot first learned his Marxism in Paris in 1952, when such philosophers as Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty were explaining how terror could be the midwife to humanism. So, if the debate remains on the level of the quantitative atrocity, the double standard collapses, and communism appears as the more criminal totalitarianism. But if the debate is shifted to qualitative crime, this outcome is easily reversed. And here, the decisive factor is again the Holocaust, as the confirmation of Nazism's uniquely evil nature. Indeed, this standard has become so universal that other persecuted groups, from Armenians to the native peoples of both Americas, have appropriated with varying degrees of plausibility the term genocide to characterize their own experience. Not surprisingly, many of these implicit comparisons to the Holocaust have been rejected as illegitimate, even slanderous. And in fact, one overexcited op-ed piece in Le Monde from a respected researcher denounced Couture's introduction as anti-Semitic. Yet, there are other, less emotionally charged arguments for assigning a significant distinctiveness to Nazi terror. The criminal law everywhere distinguishes degrees of murder according to the motivation, the cruelty of the means employed, and so on. Thus, Raymond Aron long ago and Francois Frouet recently, though both unequivocal about the evil of communism, distinguished between extermination practiced to achieve a political objective, no matter how perverse, and extermination as an end in itself. And in this perspective, communism once again comes off as less evil than Nazism. This plausible distinction, however, can be easily turned on its head. In particular, Eastern European dissidents have argued that mass murder in the name of a noble ideal is more perverse than it is in the name of a base one. The Nazis, after all, never pretended to be virtuous. The communists, by contrast, trumpeting their humanism, hoodwinked millions around the globe for decades, and so got away with murder on the ultimate scale. The Nazis, moreover, killed off their victims without ideological ceremony. The communists, by contrast, usually compelled their prey to confess their guilt and sign depositions, thereby acknowledging the party line's political correctness. Nazism, finally, was a unique case. Mussolini's fascism was not really competitive, and it developed no worldwide clientele. By contrast, communism's universalism permitted it to metastasize worldwide. A final position, forcefully expressed by Alain Bescon, is that murder is murder, whatever the ideological motivation, and this is undeniably true for the equally dead victims of both Nazism and communism. Such absolute equivalence is also expressed in Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. Both systems massacred their victims not for what they did, such as resisting the regime, but for who they were, whether Jews or kulaks. In this perspective, the distinction made by some that the term petit bourgeois kulak is more elastic and hence less lethal than biological Jew is invalidated. The social and the racial categories are equally pseudo-scientific. Yet none of these qualitative arguments can be clinched, unlike an empirical established victim count. And since there could be no consensus regarding degrees of political evil, some researchers would claim that all value judgments merely express the ideological preferences of their authors. Such positivists, social scientists, therefore, have averred that moral questions are irrelevant to understanding the past. An example is a recent volume devoted to political denunciation in modern Europe. The introduction presents some fascinating facts. In 1939, the Gestapo employed 7,500 people in contrast to the NKVD's 366,000, including Gulag personnel. And the Communist Party made denunciation as an obligation, whereas the Nazi Party did not. But no conclusions are drawn from these contrasts. Instead, we are told that under both regimes, the population was given to denunciation as an everyday practice, and for reasons of self-advancement more than for reasons of ideology. I'm going to read that again. Under both regimes, the population was given to denunciation as an everyday practice, and for reasons of self-advancement more than for reasons of ideology. We are told further that denunciation was endemic in pre-revolutionary rural Russia, and that it flourished under the French Jacobins and the English Puritans, the Spanish Inquisition and the American McCarthyism. And in fact, all the witch crazes enumerated in the introduction did have some traits in common. The rub is, however, that this perspective reduces politics and ideology everywhere to anthropology. And with this accomplished, the editors blandly assure us that, contrary to Hannah Arendt, the Nazi-Soviet similarities are insufficient to make denunciation a specifically totalitarian phenomenon. What is more, the difference between Nazi communist systems and Western ones is not qualitative, but quantitative. By implication, therefore, singling out communist and Nazi terror in order to equate them becomes Cold War slander. The ideological subtext, as it happens, of 25 years of revisionist, social reductionist Sovietology. By the same token, this fact-for-fact's sake approach suggests that there is nothing specifically communist about communist terror, and, it would seem, nothing particularly Nazi about Nazi terror either. So the bloody Soviet experiment is banalized into one great gray anthropological blur. And the Soviet Union is transmogrified into just another country, in just another age, neither more nor less evil than any other regime going. But this is obviously nonsense. Hence we are back with the problem of moral judgment, which is inseparable from any real understanding of the past. Indeed, inseparable from being human. In the 20th century, however, morality is not primarily a matter of eternal varieties or transcendental imperatives. It is above all a matter of political allegiances. That is, it is a matter of left versus right, roughly defined as the priority of compassionate egalitarianism for the one and as the primacy of prudential order for the other. Just as neither principle can be applied absolutely without destroying society, the modern world lives in perpetual tension between the irresistible pressure for equality and the functional necessity of hierarchy. It is this syndrome that gives the permanent qualitative advantage to communism over Nazism in any evaluation of their quantitative atrocities. For the communist project in origin claimed commitment to universalistic and egalitarian goals, whereas the Nazi project offered only unabashed national egoism. Small matter, then, that their practices were comparable, their moral auras were antithetical, and it is the latter feature that counts in Western domestic politics. And so we arrive at the fulcrum of the debate. A moral man can have no enemies to the left. A perspective in which undue insistence on communist crime only plays into the hands of the right. If indeed, any anti-communism is not simply a mask for anti-liberalism. In this spirit, Le Monde's editorialist deemed the Black Book inopportune because equating communism with Nazism removed the last barriers to legitimizing the extreme right, that is, Le Pen. It is true that Le Pen's party and similar hate-mongering xenophobic movements elsewhere in Europe represent an alarming new phenomenon that properly concerns all liberal Democrats. But in no way follows that communism's criminal past should be ignored or minimized. Such an argument is only a variant in new historical circumstances of Sartre's celebrated sophism that one should keep silent about auto workers. One should keep silent about Soviet camps. Per ne pas désespérer Belancourt, in order not to throw the auto workers of Belancourt into despair. To which his one-time colleague, Albert Camus, long ago replied that the truth is the truth, and denying it mocks the causes both of humanity and of morality. In fact, the persistence of such sophistry is precisely why the Black Book is so opportune. What, therefore, do its provocative pages contain? Without pretension to originality, it presents a balance sheet of our current knowledge of communism's human costs, archivally based where possible, and elsewhere drawing on the best available secondary evidence and with due allowance for the difficulties of quantification. Yet the very sobriety of this inventory is what gives this book its power. And indeed, as we are led from country to country and from horror to horror, the cumulative impact is overwhelming. At the same time, the book quietly advances a number of important analytical points. The first is that communist regimes did not just commit criminal acts. All states do so on occasion. They were criminal enterprises in their very essence. On principle, so to speak, they all ruled lawlessly, by violence, and without regard to human life. Worth's section on the Soviet Union is thus titled "A State Against Its People," and takes us methodically through the successive cycles of terror from Great October in 1917 to Stalin's death in 1953. By way of comparison, he notes that between 1825 and 1917, Tsarism carried out 6,321 political executions, most of them during the revolution of 1905 to 1907. Whereas in 2 months of the official Red Terror in the fall of 1918, Bolshevism achieved some 15,000. And so on for a third of a century. For example, 6 million deaths during the collectivization famine of 1932 to 33, 7,200,000 executions during the Great Purge, 7 million people entering the Gulag, where huge numbers died in the years 1934 to 1941, and 2,750,000 still there at Stalin's death. True, these aggregates represent different modes of state violence, not all of them immediately lethal, but all betoken terror as a routine means of government. Let me remind you, we all learned something these past few years, right? And the less familiar figures in Margot's chapter on China's long march into the night, are even more staggering. At minimum, 10 million direct victims, probably 20 million deaths out of the multitudes that passed through China's hidden gulag, the Laogai. More than 20 million deaths from the political famine of the Great Leap Forward of 1959 to 1961, the largest famine in history. Finally, in Pol Pot's aping of Mao's Great Leap, around 1 Cambodian in 7 perished, the highest proportion of the population in any communist country. The book's second point is that there never was a benign initial phase of communism before some mythical wrong turn threw it off track. From the start, Lenin expected, indeed wanted, civil war to crush all, quote, class enemies. And this war, principally against the peasants, continued with only short pauses until 1953. So much for the fables of good Lenin, bad Stalin. And if anyone doubts that it is still necessary to make this case, the answer may be found, for example, in the Maudlin article, Lenin, in the current edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Still another point is of a technical nature, the use of famine to break peasant resistance to regime economic plans. And ever since Solzhenitsyn, such pharaonic methods have been contrasted with the technologically advanced Nazi gas chamber. A more basic point is that Red Terror cannot be explained as the prolongation of pre-revolutionary political cultures. Communist repression did not originate from above in traditional autocracies, nor was it simply an intensification of violent folk practices from below, whether the peasant anarchism of Russia or the cyclical millenarian revolts of China or the exacerbated nationalism of Cambodia, although all these traditions were exploited by the new regime. Nor does the source of communist practices reside in the violence of the two world wars, important though this brutal conditioning was. Rather, in each case, mass violence against the population was a deliberate policy of the new revolutionary order, and its scope and inhumanity far exceeding anything in the national past. A final point, insisted on by courteous yet clear also in his colleagues' accounts, is that communism's recourse to permanent civil war rested on the scientific Marxist belief in class struggle as the violent midwife of history. In Marx's famous metaphor, similarly, Curtis adds, Nazi violence was founded on a scientific social Darwinism promising national regeneration through racial struggle. This valid emphasis on ideology as the wellspring of communist mass murder reaches its apogee in Margolin's depiction of escalating radicalism as the revolution moved east. Stalin, of course, had already begun the escalation by presenting himself as the Lenin of today. And his first 5-year plan as a 2nd October. Then in 1953, 4 years later, after Mao came to power, his heirs ended mass terror. It had simply become too costly to their now super-puissant regime. To the Chinese comrades, however, Moscow's moderation amounted to betrayal of the world revolution, just as it was taking off in Asia. Consequently, in 1959 to 1961, Mao was goaded to surpass his Soviet mentors by a great leap forward beyond mere socialism, Moscow style, to full communism, as Marx had imagined it in the Communist Manifesto and the Critique of the Gotha Program, and in 1996 to 1976, by directing the anarchy of the Cultural Revolution against his own party, he proceeded to outdo Stalin's Great Purge of his party in 1937 to 39. But the most demented spin-off of this whole tradition was Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge of 1975 to 1979. For this rampage against urban bourgeois civilization expressed nothing less than an ambition to propel tiny Cambodia beyond Mao's achievements into the front rank of world revolution. But the long-term inefficiency of such progress eventually led Mao's heirs in their turn to betray the Marxist-Leninist impetus by halting mass terror and turning halfway to the market. Thereby, after 1979, Deng Xiaoping ended worldwide the perverse Prometheism launched in October 1917. Perverse Prometheism, well said. Thus, the communist trajectory, as the Black Book traces it from Petrograd to China Seas, inevitably suggests that ideology, not social process, fueled the movement's meteoric rise, that ideology's practical failure produced its precipitate to fall. This transnational perspective goes far toward answering the great question posed by communist history, namely, why did a doctrine premised on proletarian revolution in industrial societies come to power only in predominantly agrarian ones? By Marxist definition, those least prepared for socialism. But socialist revolution for Marx was not just a matter of economic development. It was at bottom an eschatological leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Since such quasi-miraculous transformation has the strongest allure for those who have the greatest lag to overcome, it is hardly surprising that Marxism's line of march turned out to lead ever farther into the politically and economically backward East. Only by taking account of this paradoxical eastward escalation through increasingly extravagant leaps can we build a real historiography of the great 20th century story that is communism. And this brings us back to the vexed and vexing question raised by Stephanie Cortu in the Black Book. What of the moral equivalence of communism with Nazism? After 50 years of debate, it's clear that no matter what the hard facts are, degrees of totalitarian evil will be measured as much in terms of present politics as in terms of past realities. So we will always encounter a double standard as long as there exists a left and a right, which will be a very long time indeed. No matter how thoroughly the communist failure may come to be documented, and new research makes it look worse every day, we will always have reactions such as that of Moscow correspondent for a major Western paper who, after the fall, could still privately salute the Russian people with, "Thanks for having tried." And there will always be kindred spirits to dismiss the Black Book a priori as right-wing anti-communist rhetoric. For more mundane observers, however, it is at last becoming clear that our current qualitative judgments are scandalously out of line with the century's real balance sheet of political crime. And this very absurdity, perhaps, brings us to a turning point. 10 years ago, the authors of the Black Book would have refused to believe that what they now write. And exploration of the Soviet archives and eventually those of East Asia will continue to redress the balance. This comes at a time, moreover, when historical writing is turning increasingly to retrospective affirmative action, to fulfilling our duty of remembrance to all the oppressed of the past. Indeed, when governments and churches formally apologize for their historic sins, surely then the party of humanity can spare a little compensation for the victims of the inhumanity so long meted out by so many of its own partisans. Even so, such an effort at retrospective justice will always encounter one intractable obstacle. Any realistic accounting of communist crimes would effectively shut the door on utopia. And too many good souls in this unjust world cannot abandon hope for an absolute end to inequality. And some less good souls will always offer them rational, curative nostrums. And so, all comrade questers after historical truth should gird their loins for a very long march indeed, before communism has accorded its fair share of absolute evil. So what to do? Well, good thing we're Americans. Well, I am. Because we were told and advised on what to do a long time ago. So what do? Well, I find it interesting that Barack Obama, during his farewell address when he left office, decided to, or rather his speechwriter decided to, bastardize a very specific portion of Washington's farewell address. I also find it darkly funny that every year at the halls of our government, one party and then another party takes turns reading this document. I also find it rather funny that it's been pretty much proven that the primary author of this document, Hamilton, was trained in yeshiva, and is, because of all accounts of what it means, since his mother was a Jew, he is. So there's a very ancient bit of wisdom here, which I dare say, one way to look at this is that parteniost, or party spirit, which is what this left-right paradigm ultimately is a golden calf, at best. It is the thing that we built right after we got out of Egypt, discovered that we were born free. That's why we were wandering 40 years. We didn't believe it. Can't believe it. No, I'm not free. I'm suffering. I'm struggling. Or, shit, I'm really free. God damn, that sucks. I mean, it's not... I mean, who the heck would choose the god of Auschwitz after all? Right? It's in the choosing and the not knowing that the really good stuff is. I mean, that's why I think, and I again go back to what I said in the beginning, the literists will literally destroy us all. But Hamilton, I think, was a little bit, well, there's a reason he was who he was and did a lot of great stuff. And not all of us can be, kind of the mediocre masses here. But what he says is that and most people, quote, don't have foreign entanglements in this, but people forget that his greatest and most solemn warning was about the spirit of party. He says, I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. The spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed, but in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness, and it is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and the duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjugated to the policy and the will of another. 2020 on. There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This, within certain limits, is probably true. And in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence, if not with favor, upon the spirit of party. But in those of the popular character, in governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose. And there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be, by force of public opinion, to mitigate and assuage it. A fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. So okay, so we should assuage it, but now we've got this whole system in place. What do we do? You can't run for any, okay. I mean, I admire Trump for dealing with what we're actually dealing with. This is where people who have the responsibility, who have found themselves in positions where they are now making a living as influencers who may at one point feel their egos going off and saying, well, I said this first. No, I said this first. I got this first. Great, fine. How we choose to put it's more difficult to quite understand a free market in the media system we're in now, isn't it? It's more challenging. So this is why I say, I'm speaking now to the people out there who have an artist spirit, whether you're in mathematics, the sciences, politics, or anywhere going on. And really, in biblical Hebrew, the word for art and truth are intertwined. I've said it before, and I really firmly believe this, that politics and culture are not up and downstream from each other. That's something that somebody in politics would say. Culture is the stream. Politics are just embankments. So we lost a lot of memory, a lot of killing on purpose, arguably even more recently. But for those people out there who feel some sort of kinship with that long-term memory and that stream that goes on and on and on, I encourage you to look at the dissidents of before. The artists sometimes turn politicians. We know a few right now. I mean, there's a reason that a showman managed to do what he's done. There's a reason. And there's also a reason why Mao was a poet and his wife a dancer. But like James Lindsay says, don't blame the metal for the rust. Remember what Bukowski warned. Unable to create art, they will not understand art. They'll see their failure as creators only as a failure of the world. Unable to love fully, they will see your love as incomplete, and then they will hate you, and their hatred will be perfect. A complete annihilation. This strange Jonestown-like self-destruction is why I keep saying that totalitarian creep has a mechanized religiosity. I encourage us to try not to use these terms anymore that allow us to continue that Hegelian spiral and make it no longer a moral issue, but a political one. Totalitarian creep is totalitarian creep. Falling for identitarianism and a socialist or sociopathic view of reality is a lie. A lie is a lie. The truth is the truth. It's that simple. And if we continue to keep looking at this in a very, wanting to be part of my crew or comrades rather than friendships with a capital F, we're screwed for a lot longer until the damn thing absolutely just self-destructs. What will be left is the question when that happens, because it's not natural. It's not. So what else can we do? A lot of the people who are very much, kind of yelling and screaming when they believe themselves to be more aligned with, say, what they're calling a nationalism or Christianity, which, by the way, it is neither any more than socialist or social or democratic, right? And by the way, since when were we a pure democracy? No, we're a constitutional republic. And it's look, the American dream is not simply, anybody who's come to America will tell you, it's the act of dreaming. It's not the picket fence. It's not what you acquire. It's not the consumer, things. It's not, what you can sell to somebody. And frankly, if somebody's trying to sell you, I don't know, something like a guerrilla mindset, maybe ask a question if they may not have a bit of a bias themselves about what it is that they're selling. And it doesn't mean that they're not correct in some things. I do see a lot of the roots of this coming from a very unfortunate lack of rites of passage, primarily for men. Kind of a byproduct of the unfortunate Marxification of our genders in two different ways. But now we're seeing the kind of male version of feminism. Can we just not do that, please? It didn't work very well for anybody. Get rid of the victim shit. You're born free. You overly worry about whether or not you're able to, I don't know, it's almost as if this passing along of DNA is as cuckoo as some women's obsession with abortion access. That has nothing to do with autonomy, ultimately. We don't have control over everything. We don't. I mean, that's one thing that I can tell you as a woman who, you know, our concept of time for women and men, very different. You gotta get over this. I mean, some men, unfortunately, it's almost as if, you know, when people talk about, like, methinks the lady doth protest too much, an obsession over passing along your DNA. It's not just autistic. It's not even akin to what I see. I see a little bit of this even in Musk. Yes, we need to make sure there's enough people on the planet, but really the issue there has not been so much, you know, oh, we have to raise birth rates like you would in a factory, in a machine. No. That's what communists did in China or in Romania. Really, it's what does it mean when the most natural thing in the world becomes politicized to such a point that when it's gone, you don't even realize you've lost it. And for those women out there, first of all, I'll commend a lot of us who were being, you know, labeled as, you know, childless cat owners, which, by the way, I have a dog. I'm allergic to cats. But we didn't bite the bait. There's a wisdom that comes with something that we wouldn't wish on anyone. I know I wouldn't. But also a sense of responsibility. And it's a little more nuanced and balanced. I mean, are you going to tell me that women were not handling their own issues with procreation long before there was any government involved? Come on. But we were also punished for doing such things. A lot of the things that's supposed to be the feminine mystique and private have become so public that it's lost something. It's become dehumanized, mechanized, and turned into this bizarre consumer black hole. And consumerism and the free market are not the same thing. They're not. As we have, I think, really been given the message, especially over the last few years. And the most brilliant writing on that, I think, has been from the playwright Václav Havel. And the same people who seem to be very opposed to be lumped in with behavior that, you know, if you don't like these comparisons, don't do comparable things, really hate Václav Havel's essay. They think it has no merit now because he removes in an instant the hierarchical bullshit. But also, it is long. And it takes time to understand because he's trying to explain a philosophy that is so anti-human and unnatural. And frankly, brilliant. Like a dark spell, dark magic that keeps getting recast. We saw it with the Aztecs. We saw it in Jonestown. We saw it during the Russian purges, Stalinist purges. We saw it during COVID. We see it over and over again. And it's this mythology that tries to fabricate human experience as collectivist, purely collectivist. It's so strange and self-defeating and immature that it's very difficult to explain it. But it's not of the left or the right. It's a human problem. It can be fueled by party spirit. Gets us super fueled by ideology. But then as we try more and more to label it and give it definition over it and not just say it's anti-human. It's not. The word that was supposed to be originally used to defeat this was liberalism. a liberalism of the spirit, a focus on the power and the strength of the individual, as frightening as it may be. These things being self-evident that all humans are created equal. And I say humans because just because the language says man, listen, did you know that in not every language there's any gendered pronouns? Hungarian doesn't exist. My mother's mother tongue, she's misgendering me all the time. I was he, whatever. Chinese, same thing. The only things you can gender in Hungarian are animals. When Orban was being chastised by the EU for not adopting gendered pronouns, it would have been dehumanizing to do so. Isn't that interesting? How this pronoun phenomenon was so dehumanizing, especially of our children. It's so pervasive. There's a reason that some rituals and some behaviors seem almost like dark magic. And that's what Socrealism ultimately is. A false reality. But the good news is that it is something which also is very, very, very weak. So what can you do about it? Well, for one thing, I would say that an understanding that you, whoever's listening to this right now, whether you agree with me, or you don't agree with me, or you want to argue with me about it, whatever it is, the good news and the bad news is, the good news is you're essential. The bad news is you're essential. The good news is you are very important. The bad news is you are very important. And you're not always going to feel like it, of course, but that's the reality, because that means that you're also, much like in Jonestown, where they were both enslaved to and also created the People's Temple, same thing, in a beautiful way. Places like churches and Christianity at its best, and all more with a higher purpose, a higher, more divine, unknowable purpose. It captures that. That's one of the reasons why religion is such an important thing for those people who survived communist regimes. I mean, my mother, even though we're Jews, would wear a cross as a statement against the state, because a state that elevates itself to the most powerful thing, which is basically all you're doing when you are aligning yourself more as left or right or Republican or whatever it is, you are putting your value system into that worships a state. Instead of, you're serving the state automatically by de facto, rather than what it's supposed to do, which is just be in service to you. And that's the thing I don't understand, why people don't realize that this is self-evident. And look, it's a much bigger problem than I would know how to undo, but I would say it would begin with, for example, no longer allowing party spirit to fuel political rhetoric as easily. I cringe every time I hear Trump call something liberal that it isn't, because he's basically doing Mao's job for him. There is a reason why the only people who truly see that word as dangerous as it is, in its truest meaning. Now, if that meaning is lost, then we need another word. Fine. I'm all about that. But let's begin with stopping this bullshit left-right paradigm, because if I have one more person call me a shit lib, I mean, I got this big long list: anti-vaxxer, shit lib, Jew, whatever. It's endless. It's identitarian bullshit. And especially when you've got this means of communication, it's not going to get us anywhere, and it allows a lot of people to use you. Or did we not notice 2020? And the fact of the matter is there's some people who really suffered. I mean, how many people do we know? I mean, I know of many people who are way too similar to what happened to my grandfather. Political prisoners. We're playing real close to, way too close a game of totalitarian romper room here. I mean, come on, America, grow up. Seriously, just grow up about it. And take some responsibility. And don't let, as Chungyam Trungpa warned us, spiritual materialism overtake you. And one clue, in my humble opinion, is anybody who's encouraging you to take Joe Rogan doesn't encourage drug use. He talks about his experience with it, but somebody saying you should take ayahuasca, go fuck yourself. You don't get to pretend that the only way to be awakened to consciousness is through a substance that's cooked up by somebody and given to you so that you've got to puke and you've got to go through this crazy experience, which I will tell you doesn't make a lot of sense and was once used to keep as a sort of amnesiac, but also, keep calm children as they were being sacrificed for debt to the gods. It's a little sociopathic. That doesn't even say that it can't be a good thing for you to experience. Honestly, there used to be a time when it just wasn't considered cool to encourage that kind of level of drug use. It wasn't considered cool. It was considered, let's not repeat the, don't drop bombs, drop acid, man, because it is, come on. It's like saying, walking straight into the Fox house after, falsely crying, the sky is falling. Don't be so freaking stupid. It's stupid. And not everything has to be so publicized, and not everything is some proof that you are one with everything and you are God and you are divinely ordained. You have like some special mission. Humility. I heard a rabbi recently say, God's not a fan of that kind of level of pomposity. Pride, right? Pride. Weren't you just talking about how terrible pride was pridefully? Okay, check yourself, guys. Seriously. But what else can you do? So let's look at what happened. This is going to be the end of this. But the power of truth and what to do once you realize, okay, this is a crazy party tango we're doing that's just basically going to destroy itself. I could prove that some more, but what do you do about it? Especially once you realize, oh crap, I can't, say that I had nothing to do with it because I'm essential and they need you. So what do you do? Well, this is why I call it totalitarian creep, because it's creeping. It always will, I think. But it's not so much about... Havel said that we're not dealing with dictatorships. We're dealing with something else. And that's what I want to talk for a second about. What do you do with this something else? And I think that it is much more akin to the threat we're given with AI than the reality of it. Because, for example, to call AI an artist is akin to calling like a Stradivarian violin the composer. It doesn't make sense. Because creating something is the process. Women, we should know this. We understand more than men do that there is a process to creation, and to a large degree you have to go through a lot of discomfort, but also a submission to it. And also we don't have full control, despite what science likes to tell us. And for women, some of you out there like me, our sense of time is very different. There's a moment suddenly, no, it's too bad. And we don't get to pass along our DNA. Damn. Good thing that we're not just crawling around on our hind legs anymore, because we can still find ways to realize that we were here at all. Because life is not, you're mortal. So it makes life wonderful. Until the world to come, that's what we know. And it's not for us to understand what that would look like. We can do mitzvah and good deeds to try to help usher a better time along, but we can't messianically try to create something, because that's what gets us into big trouble. So Vaslav says that truth in a totalitarian system is so powerful, more powerful than people realize. And the best example I think we all have of that right now is what we saw with Donald Trump, what he did after he was shot. Now, I'm not talking about the man here, I'm just talking about what he did. We saw what a hero is. That's what a man will do in that moment. I don't know if I'd do that. I think that moment, we all saw something. And we all yearn for that because there's something holy in, or almost godly in, a moment like that. He could have not, he said fight, 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 but he could have been saying Fojus L'chaim. It was more than just bravery. There was something, and it doesn't mean that in a second later he wasn't falling into Partenios or whatever, but there was something there that not everybody's got. Something noble in that moment. And then we saw something happen right away, the way the world reacted to it, almost like physics. The regime, the totalitarian regime, and all of its anonymity and its machine, like, it reacted to it in such a way that I think proves that Havel's thesis of the post-totalitarian system, and that is what we are dealing with, and the way to destroy it is correct. I'm going to close this out by reading portions of my most recent Substack to you, because I want to pose, what do you do about that genius of that crowd? Remember, he says there is enough treachery, hatred, violence, absurdity in the average human being to spy any given army on any given day. Well, for one thing, we don't need masses. We don't need the majority. That's not what changes things. And no, transparency is not the best disinfectant, because not everything needs to be disinfected. And as women can tell you, not everything needs to be known and outspoken. There is power in the mystique, in glamour, in the unknown. And what Havel says is that the most powerful are the powerless, because they access a certain kind of power in what he called the hidden sphere. I would dare say there's something very, an understanding of one's relationship and choosing a relationship to that hidden sphere over and over again. From in truth and willingness to say that you don't know, and an understanding that you are not powerless, but you feel powerless. So from my Substack called Artful Veritas, the very first one, it's owana.substack.com, needs an editing, but here's what I basically say. First quote: if you design your action well, you can force your target into a situation where they have no good options. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't. This is known as a decision dilemma, end quote, from Beautiful Trouble. Quote: there is absolutely no such thing in the world as love or hatred without reason or cause. Evidently, he didn't have a mother. Just saying. There's absolutely no such thing in the world as love or hatred without reason or cause. As for the so-called love of humanity, there has been no such all-inclusive love since humanity was divided into classes. All the ruling classes of the past were fond of advocating for it, and so were many so-called sages and wise men, but nobody has ever really practiced it, because it is impossible in a class society. There will be genuine love of humanity after classes are eliminated all over the world. Classes have split society into many antagonistic groupings. There will be love of all humanity when classes are eliminated, but not now. We cannot love enemies. We cannot love social evils. Our aim is to destroy them. This is common sense. Can it be that some of our writers and artists still do not understand this? At the Yearning Forum on Literature and Art, now, 1942. In order to defeat an enemy, we must first be able to understand what it actually is and what it isn't. I think there are insights into our current situation which can be very useful. From an essay titled Power of the Powerless by playwright, dissident, and statesman Václav Havel. By the way, he was Czechoslovakian, and just going to mention Trump's choice of women is kind of interesting. The Czechs are fascinating people. Well, are there still Czechs since Czechoslovakia was Christian? Yes, there are. So, I quoted later parts of this essay often, but right now I want to focus on the earlier sections, where he explains why what they experienced, and what I believe we are also experiencing, isn't a dictatorship, or even really communism, or fascism, but rather something else. something unique to modernity, something fueled by ideology, but also requiring a very different tactic to defeat it. I'll be quoting from it, and also trying to, later in this, summarize its nature, but I do encourage you to find the time to read the entire thing. His mind is very missed. You can find his essay, by the way, on the from the Hannah Arendt Center, which is hac.bard.edu. Right there you can find the whole essay. And he wrote this and then it later led to the 1977 Charter. But this essay is remarkably powerful. And you can tell, if you're an artist, you can tell that he's a playwright because of how he lays the stage. So the key to understanding what we face, I believe, is understanding the nature of ideology and the way it actually, unique to the circumstances described by Havel, but also warned by Havel, relates to power in what he called a post-totalitarian system. He did not mean after a totalitarian period. Angelo Codevilla, before he died a few years ago, also wrote an essay in The American Mind, which I'm reminded of whenever I read the Havel piece. I'll be sharing portions of the Codevilla essay as well, titled Revolution 2020. I encourage you to read his essay as well, sooner rather than later. In American Mind, he wrote, and this was prior to the results of the election in 2020, quote, progressivism's foundational proposition that the American way of life suffers from excessive freedom and insufficient latitude for experts to lead each into doing what is best for all is the intellectual basis of the oligarchy's ever-increasing size, wealth, and power. The theme that the USA was ill-conceived in 1776 to 89 and must be reconceived has resounded from Woodrow Wilson's congressional government in 1885 to the campaigns of Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, Barack Obama, and Joseph Biden. Listen to the scientists. The criticism's main point has been constant. America's original conception validated people's right to live as they please and made it hard to marshal them for progressive purposes. But the progressive critique adds a moral basis. The American people's indulgence of their preferences, private ease and comfort, focus on families, religious observance, patriotism, has made for every secular sin imaginable. Racism, sexism, greed, etc., because most Americans are racist, sexist, unappreciative of real virtue or refinement, and somehow these are all rolled in together. Because these Americans resist knuckling under to their betters. America is a sick society that needs to be punished and to have its noxious freedoms reformed. Hence the revolution that created the American oligarchy, illiterate contemporary Marxists notwithstanding, has nothing in common with the Karl Marx's original democratic in the Aristotelian sense of conception from below. For example, his 1875 critique of the Gotha program, other than overthrowing the pillars of the house. Ours is the party-centered, oligarchic revolution from above that Lenin outlined in What is to be Done, 1902. This Leninism is the template of the Soviet and every other communist regime, bar none. In our revolution, too, everything, always, and everywhere is about the party. Note that last sentence. Like I said, we were warned about the danger of party very early on in America's founding. In fact, we were warned before our first election, which, of course, by the way, immediately we fell back into the pattern. So it's that understandable. It's not that there's something wrong with us, it's just part of human nature. So we can do better. And we have, in periods of time. In Washington's farewell address, it was written, from their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit for every solitary purpose, and there being a constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be, by force of public opinion, to mitigate and assuage it. A fire not to be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent it bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming it should consume. I believe that this concept of party, and the way it grows, to become far more dangerous than helpful in a purely elective government as predicted in that speech, has a very interesting parallel, and one that's very useful in order to defeat our problem. In order to understand this, we require a historical understanding of party since the 1917 revolution. We see this in America with the dawn of Wilsonian progressivism. Codevilla wrote, quote, the moral class critique from above was always implicit. It largely stayed in the background of the campaigns for social improvements into which progressives have led the American people ever since the 1930s, and especially since the 1960s. The ruling class chided Americans for insufficient commitment to education, to well-being for the poor and disadvantaged, to a healthy natural environment, and to public health, as well as for the oppressing of women, and above all, for racism. The campaigns for remedying these conditions have been based on propositions advanced by the most highly credentialed persons in America, experts certified by the U.S. government, whom the media treat as truth-telling scientists, their opponents as enemies of the people. He continued, but each and all of these campaigns produced mostly the ostensible objectives opposites, while increasing the number of oligarchies' members and then wealth and power, and endowing them with socio-political clientelism as well as with levers for manipulating them. As its members' powers grew, they developed a taste for disdaining independent Americans and acquired whips for punishing them. Now, end quote. Now, it is at first sight a simple fight between two groups. One could even call this a class struggle. But Havel, in 1977, discovered something which I believe is a key to understanding where we actually are. But first we need to explore a bit more what party means from the point of view of Marxism, or, as I would believe it would be better to call it, liberation theology. My sense is that we are not actually simply facing two different political ideas battling it out, but rather one religious idea, masquerading as economic, philosophical, and political, while in truth, it is in fact a religious ideology, with a method of absorbing all which oppose it into itself via the power of narrative. That is the great narrative. And it has a structure. It also has a singular author. That author is party. More accurately, it would be the party spirit, or even will. Under the Soviets, by the way, just a side note, have you noticed so many people say free will does not exist, but these are people who are quite worshipping of partenost, or party? They seem to go hand in hand. Under the Soviets, this term was partenost. It is a transliteration of the Russian term. In Chinese, it is translated as jiangjing. It can variously translated as party-mindedness, partisanship, or party spirit. By the way, the definition of bigotry is an extreme partisanship. It is one of the philosophical pillars of the great narrative, which was, and still is, Socrealism, or socialist realism. These pillars are Klassavost, or class-mindedness, or consciousness; Narodnost, or people, folk-mindedness, or orientation toward the masses; Ideanost, idea-mindedness, emphasizing that ideas should reflect those of the party, as well as motivating people for a certain aim, ideology; and of course, Partenost, or party-mindedness, meaning that every expression was considered political, and the foundation of all knowledge is the party. Party is the only purveyor of ideology, and ideology supersedes all knowledge, all history, all wisdom. Morality is not determined by amalgamated wisdom, Torah, the Gospels, or from within the human spirit. There is no human spirit. There is only partenost, party spirit. And that spirit has a singular goal, unified and in total, and it is determined by party, not a parent, not a teacher, and certainly not from any internal choice. The human being is not, according to this principle, capable of making such decisions. It echoes in an interesting way what Codevilla wrote in 2020, but I intend to reframe it. He said, "The logic that derives each turn of our revolutionary spiral is progressive Americans' inheritable, insatiable desire to exercise their superiority over those they deem inferior. Its force, I observed, comes not from the substance of the progressives' demands, but rather from that which moves, changes, and multiplies their demands without end. That is, the progressives' affirmation of superior worth to be pursued by exercising dominance, superior identity affirmed via the inferior's humiliation. Affirmation of one's own superiority by punishing inferiors is an addictive pleasure. It requires ever stronger, purer doses of infliction, and is inherently beyond satisfaction. That's what I think Chögyam Trungpa touches on with the idea of spiritual materialism. In short, the progressive ruling class's intensifying effort to oppress those they imagine to be their inferiors is not reversible. It is far less a choice of policy than it is the consequence of its awakening to its own identity, awakening to the powers and privileges which they imagine their superior worth entitles them. It is awakening to its deep resentment, indeed, to hate, for whoever does not submit preemptively, end quote. What he recognizes as the quality of progressiveness, I think he and most people fail to recognize as the spirit of party in general, or Partenost, or Jiangjing. More of a priest guild. Party is the sole purveyor of ideology, and ideology is whatever assures the party it has an existence. Ideology, rather than principle, is how decisions are made, and how power is transferred from one person to the next. Ultimately, all principle, all morals, all ethics, all identity becomes subordinated to ideology, to Ideanost. It is essential to understand the power dynamic here. Party cannot exist without ideology, and ideology cannot exist without party. This dialectical is like a black hole, which sucks in everything and everyone around it because it exists only to exist. It makes decisions based only on what will serve its existence. And as it grows in power, it permits into its praxis only those so long as they will serve it. We have not yet entered a complete transformation into a social totality in which there is no escape from the singularity of Ideanost watched by the guards of Partenost, and in truth, since it is so unnatural, I don't believe it's actually any more possible than the foolish idea that you can ever reach the horizon line. However, the consistent belief that it is possible, whether it is right or wrong, is what makes this so dangerous. This, in short, is what in The Power of the Powerless Václav Havel calls the post-totalitarian society. Václav explains brilliantly, and we would be wise to listen to him now, how this is distinctly different from a dictatorship, no matter how much it may seem to resemble one. In fact, that resemblance is merely another form of totalitarian creep obscuring itself and hiding itself behind its primary ally, ideology. In Power of the Powerless, he writes, quote, "Our system is most frequently characterized as a dictatorship, or more precisely as the dictatorship of a political bureaucracy over a society that has undergone economic and social leveling. I'm afraid that the term dictatorship, regardless of how intelligible it may be otherwise, tends to obscure rather than clarify the real nature of power in the system." End quote. He explains that the qualities that define and make up a dictatorial system are as follows. 1. A small group of people take over the government of a given country by force. 2. Their power is wielded openly, using the direct instruments of power at their disposal. 3. That they are easily distinguished socially from the majority over whom they rule. 4. It is temporary, ephemeral, lacking historical roots. 5. Its existence seems to be bound up with the lives of those who established it. 6. It is usually local in extent and significance. 7. Its power derives ultimately from the numbers and the armed might of its soldiers and police. 8. The threat to its existence is that someone better equipped might appear and overthrow it. This may appear to be, to a great degree, our situation. It is not. He explains first some simple but important realities which made up the Soviet Union, but I believe strongly are not only alive and well today, but have only altered form superficially. What they share in their apparent belief system is superficially important compared to what they share in a supra-personal way. They share party spirit and ideology and are completely ruled by it. The regime itself does not dictate things ideologically, but rather, what is unique to the totality of totalitarianism is that ideology, in fact, rules it. Here first are the basic differences Václav elaborated, which we can all very much relate to. 1. Our system is not limited in a local geographical sense. Rather, it holds sway over many geographical regions and nations. We see institutions which have grown in order to sustain and maintain said system, from the WHO to the WEF to the UN and GMOs. 2. Although it quite naturally exhibits a number of local and historical variations, the range of these variations is fundamentally circumscribed by a single unifying framework. Ideologically, these shift. Sustainability, DEI, ESG, currency, etc., but none of these are ultimately ever considered more valued than the continuity of the system itself. 3. Despite there no longer being a Soviet bloc, we see clearly the attempt to conform with the base of the same principles and structure, and nearly everywhere, if not everywhere, has been penetrated by a network of manipulatory instruments designed to assure its own survival. 4. There is a historical foundation that is lacking in a classical dictatorship. Or perhaps more accurately, and I'm shifting slightly from Havel here, this foundation is in fact not so much rooted in history as rooted in a redefining of history. Lastly, what we must fully comprehend here is that unlike dictatorships or even oppressive regimes prior to modernity, this is not simply a set of ideas or ideals. It is in fact a religion. Even if most aren't even aware of it, and even if segments of its adherents differ slightly in their deity or form of worship, it is their relationship with their God or gods that is the key to understanding both the nature of what Václav calls the post-totalitarian system and what I call totalitarian creep. That key is essential to understanding its greatest weakness, as well as its very odd, unnatural, irrational, and anti-human behavior. It is difficult to describe this religion without utilizing another one in juxtaposition. This is because this new religion, which has been creeping along human society for millennia, received a kind of superfuel with the onset of industrialization and mechanization. It is of no surprise that the system itself seems to reject the very fuel that allowed it to rapidly grow and pervade everything. This is one clue to understanding the very weakness that will ultimately destroy it, or cause it to destroy itself, aka it's unsustainable. The question is only, how long will it take? And what damage will be left? And what will be left of human life or life at all when that moment comes? I often imagine Jonestown as a microcosm of totalitarian creep, although there are other examples. Much like Jonestown, the system is in fact ultimately fated to destroy its host. It is a mistake to try and apply natural rules to something this unnaturally willing to place all survival as subordinate to it. Ideology is the purveyor of, temple of, and only essential value in this system. What it worships is purpose, with a capital P. Imagine for a moment what comes to mind when you ask yourself, what is the opposite of life? Many people will say death. I would argue this is incorrect. The opposite of life is a machine. In mythology and stories, we have seen often the warnings of what happens when mechanization goes too far. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the Terminator series, Battlestar Galactica, the Jewish mystical idea of the Golem, Gollum from Lord of the Rings adapted from above, and so on, and so on. A key quality of totalitarian creep is mechanization, and therefore trivialization of life. Its opposite, and its greatest threat. Totalitarian creep, quote, commands an incomparably more precise, logically structured, generally comprehensible, and in essence extremely flexible ideology that in its elaborateness and completedness, Havel said in Power of the Powerless, is more a religion than any dictatorship or any system of rule we are familiar with, including what we typically call fascism. Remember Jonestown? This microcosm here is unmistakable, especially when one realizes that each and every member of the temple were both pillars of and enslaved by it, just as we are. That smaller, and now this new totalitarian temple offers, quote, a ready answer to any question whatsoever. It can scarcely be accepted only in part, and accepting it has profound implications for human life. In an era when metaphysical and existential certainties are in a state of crisis, when people are being uprooted and alienated and are losing their sense of what this world means, this ideology inevitably has a certain hypnotic charm. Sound familiar to what we just heard in the introduction to the Black Book? To wandering humankind, it offers an immediately available home. All one has to do is accept it. And suddenly everything becomes clear once more. Life takes on new meaning. And all mysteries, unanswered questions, anxiety, and loneliness vanish. Václav Havel. From Hannah Arendt, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but rather for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exist. Václav continues, of course, one pays dearly for this low-rent home. The price is abdication of one's own reason, conscience, and responsibility. For an essential aspect of this ideology is the consignment of reason and conscience to a higher authority. The principle involved here is that the center of power is identical to the center of truth. Truth in this context requires a definition, because it's not truth in the sense we've all known for now and mostly come to define it. It is truth that has a very insular definition. It is an illusion. Mind you, it's a very consistent and tenacious one, which in fact becomes more important than actual truth itself. It is eigenosť, which can only be determined by partenost. As Washington warned, the warmth of the spirit of party has begun its total consumption, or one might say, total capture of the means of production. What makes this new totalitarian temple so dangerous is much like when Jonestown moved from the Bay Area down to its isolation in the forests and became more itself and the landscape that surrounds us in total. Escape requires something very unusual. It has little to do with the overthrow of those who appear to lead it. Of course, there are two escape paths. Each path is based entirely on how one relates to truth. The spirit of party is much like a supernatural spirit. However, it is in fact supra-personal. The spirit is within every human being. In some faiths, it's described symbolically as one form of our soul, or perhaps even temptation. But that's irrelevant. It is part of the human condition, which was so wisely explained in Washington's farewell address, as well as in the writings of Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, and later Emerson. We see it again in Jung, and of course all the way back to Aristotle, and in a form which I personally would argue set the stage for its igniting and potential to consume, Plato. What matters, I believe, in this particular situation is an understanding again that you, each of us, everyone is involved. This is the most important thing. I believe it is the thing that is required to understand totalitarian creep distinctly from a dictatorship of any kind, but also understand both its most oppressive yet weakest point in its foundation. So let's return for a moment to the concept of the great narrative. I asked a while back, what story were we telling when the dancing nurses were telling us who was and who was not essential, and what was necessary to participate socially and happily, remember? And since then, we've heard a lot about mass formation. I think that we've been given only a narrow view, and a view which is faulty, primarily because it mechanizes the masses and describes a reality as if every person is at the mercy of the forward march of the masses, delusional as they may be. This resignation and a sort of need to duck for cover as history marches over us in its own way places purpose as an idol. It makes each of us feel powerless, against a frantic activity occurring all around us, amplified by the very mechanization which built the illusion to begin with. It's the Kool-Aid. It's Frankenstein's monster. How often do we hear today that this new industrial revolution will change everything and that we are powerless to stop it? That we must submit, be absorbed, adapt, or essentially become inessential, or worse? What story are we being told? Let me remind, quote, "Of course one pays dearly for this low-rent home. The price is abdication of one's own reason, conscience, and responsibility. For an essential aspect of this ideology is the consignment of reason and conscience to a higher authority. The principle involved here is that the center of power is identical with the center of truth," end quote, wrote Havel. Again, truth has a very different definition within totalitarian creep. Truth is only whatever the regime needs to glorify and sustain itself. Truth is subordinated to something higher. That higher thing is not based on anything established by the means human beings are accustomed to. The demoralization caused by a mechanized march towards something which seems to be ruled by anonymous flunkies and soulless automatons is of course deeply crushing to the spirit, but not to the spirit of party or to ideology, which seems to take on different standards from moment to moment and commands its apparent leadership with a kind of psychotic set of orders, seemingly contradictory and seemingly in opposition to the principles it claimed moments before. Let me remind you, this is a mechanized religion, or rather, a religion structured only to sustain itself, worshipping its purpose, which has had its core a false premise, that all history, all life, everything that has ever been and ever will be, has existed in order to fulfill its purpose, which, nihilistically, like Jonestown, is purposeless. Everything is a utility to sustain a belief in purpose, with a capital P. It is purely a mechanized way of looking at everything and all, the opposite of life. Why does the system seem to require and use the immature and the young? Well, remember your own adolescence. A child brought up in an ideal family will have a sense of self, not because they are rewarded simply for being good. Their sense of self is self-evident, not based on their effectiveness as a tool for something that is desired purely from outside themselves. That's what when that happens, we call it emotional abuse. Havel writes, quote, "Ideology is a specious way of relating to the world. It offers human beings the illusion of an identity, of dignity, and of morality, while making it easier for them to part with them. As the repository of something supra-personal and objective, it enables people to deceive their conscience and conceal their true position and their inglorious modus vivendi, both from the world and from themselves. It is a very pragmatic, but at the same time an apparently dignified way of legitimizing what is above, below, and on either side. It is directed toward people and toward God. It is a veil behind which human beings can hide their own fallen existence, their trivialization, and their adaptation to the status quo." Totalitarian creep, in its mechanized view of existence and its need to sustain its own existence, views everything and everyone only as a tool, something that solidifies or assures that existence, or as a threat to it. It is, in its own way, very, very immature as well. What Vaslav calls the post-totalitarian system, I'm calling totalitarian creep because it has not yet fully embedded itself. Even if this does not reach thousands or even tens of thousands or 10 people, I'm able to talk about this. And someone else may see it, despite any censorship or limitation. In a post-totalitarian system, that would be near impossible. The creep also, I believe, exists and may always, to some degree or another. We have a great deal of it to wade through now. But for how long, really, I believe, is up to each of us. What choices do we have? Well, Václav says that the powerless are in fact able to access a power which those in power, as it appears, do not have. In fact, we have seen recently how even those in power do have access to it. He elaborates how actual truth plays a role that is enormous, unique, and also uniquely threatening to the system. He says, quote, "Between the aims of the post-totalitarian system and the aims of life, there is a yawning abyss. While life, in its essence, moves towards plurality, diversity, independent self-constitution, and self-organization, in short, towards fulfillment of its own freedom, the post-totalitarian system demands conformity, uniformity, and discipline. While life ever strives to create new and improbable structures, the post-totalitarian system contrives to force life into its most probable states. The aims of the system reveal its most essential characteristic to be introversion, a movement toward being ever more completely and unreservedly itself, which means that the radius of its influence is continually widening as well." I'll just add from that little ayahuasca explanation, that's what it's like. You go so deep into you that you think you're connected to everything. It's really weird. The system serves people only to the extent necessary to ensure that people will serve it. I'm just going to note that I've seen a lot of people mention that they were given some task while on ayahuasca. It's pretty compelling and strange. I mean, look, is it impossible that we know people who like to, I like to describe as the people who like to watch, liked to watch what would happen with various other drugs being misused, abused, and then turned into its own devices. Kind of, that's really, like the literalists will literally kill us all kind of stuff. You don't think they would do that again? Come on. Let's get real. Soma, babies, Soma. Anything beyond this, that is to say anything which leads people to overstep their predetermined roles, is regarded by the system as an attack upon itself. And in this respect, it is correct. Every instance of such transgression is a genuine denial of the system. It can be said, therefore, that the inner aim of the post-totalitarian system is not mere preservation of power in the hands of a ruling clique, as appears to be the case at first sight, but rather the social phenomena of self-preservation is subordinated to something higher, to a kind of blind automatism which drives the system. By the way, this is what I think was the reasoning for the child sacrifices under the Aztecs. This was why. No matter what position individuals hold in the hierarchy of power, they are not considered by the system to be worth anything in themselves, but only as things intended to fuel and serve this automatism. For this reason, an individual's desire for power is admissible only insofar as its direction coincides with the direction of the automatism of the system. He then reinforces why each of us are both part of and enslaved by it, before he then explains what disintegrates it. And we had a glimpse of that very thing only, I wrote this a few days after it happened, but only a few months ago. And then the expected reaction by the system to what it perceives rightly as an attack on itself. We could even say now that the results of the the trial, the parody trial, forgot his name suddenly, the man who did the natural thing to protect women and children from somebody who was saying that they were going to die. The ideology insisted that this wasn't acceptable. The truth is, we know the truth. And there's no partisanship in this knowledge. I think Megan Kelly did a great job explaining that in her recent podcast, by the way. I recommend that. Removing the whole party bullshit. So we had a glimpse of this thing. That could be one other glimpse, but the one I was referring to was what Trump did after he was shot. And then we saw the expected reaction by the system to what it perceives, rightly, as an attack on itself. I encourage you, again, to read the entire essay, but here is a key point, perhaps the key point. Ideology, in creating a bridge of excuses between the system and the individual, spans the abyss between the aims of the system and the aims of life. It pretends that the requirements of the system derive from the requirements of life. It is a world of appearances, trying to pass for reality. That is Socrealism, or socialist realism. Or perhaps we can call it the great narrative, or the new normal. Whatever we call it, it's a lie. And it's also the structure of the testaments of this new temple and religion. It is the gospel of liberation theology, and the formula repeated over and over by its priest class. Also, much like the Aztec priests were, enslaved to the worship of purpose, and willing to sacrifice their own, themselves, and anything to that purpose. Also a Michael Jackson impersonator. See? It is new. It is a symptom of modernity, but it is derived from something very old and often obscured because it reveals its inherent quality, a false, mechanized ethics of human beings. The hero of this dark gospel is simple, and so is the structure. The hero is toil, and the toiler, struggler, is unthinkable outside the collective. That was Gorky's phrase, one of the founders of Stalinist socialist realism, adopted by Mao, Hitler, and birthed much earlier, and described by Russian actual realist writers and artists as the death of the author, the destroying of art, and by its true believers as the means to engineer human souls. Václav goes on, the post-totalitarian system touches people at every step, but it does so with its ideological gloves on. This is why life in the system is so thoroughly permeated with hypocrisy and lies. Government by bureaucracy is called popular government. The working class is enslaved in the name of the working class. The complete degradation of an individual is presented as his ultimate liberation. Depriving people of information is called making it available. The use of power to manipulate is called the public control of power. And the arbitrary abuse of power is called observing the legal code. The repression of culture is called its development. The expansion of imperial influence is presented as support for the oppressed. The lack of free expression becomes the highest form of freedom. Farcical elections become the highest form of democracy. Banning independent thought becomes the most scientific of worldviews. Military occupation becomes fraternal assistance. Because the regime is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything. It falsifies the past. It falsifies the present. And it falsifies the future. It falsifies statistics. It pretends not to possess an omnipotent and unprincipled police apparatus. It pretends to respect human rights. It pretends to persecute no one. It pretends to fear nothing. It pretends to pretend nothing. Individuals need not believe all these mystifications, but they must behave as though they did. Or they must at least tolerate them in silence, or get along well with those who work with them. For this reason, however, they must live within a lie. They need not accept the lie. It is enough for them having to accept their life with it and in it. For by this very fact, individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, make the system, are the system. End quote. You are essential. That's the truth. You are even essential for the continuation of that which you feel powerless against. That is true. That is what mechanization attempts to, through its illusion, tell you is unthinkable. Make it seem unthinkable, until it becomes, consciously or not, unthinkable, leaving you wandering in the desert, forgetting that you were born liberated, making you ever more and more like it, enslaved to purpose, worshiping purpose, and mechanized toward the great promise of the great narrative. The leap forward is figuratively and literally really a great step backward. But why this self-destructive pattern if the system demands of you only what will preserve it? Because you are just a utility. You don't have a purpose. Your purpose is its purpose. Quite immature indeed. This new hero is in fact what liberation theology's ultimate paradox is. The new man paradox. This hero as toil is not part of human nature. It is in reality the false consciousness it claims to wish to liberate you from. Quote, and this is from an article on Socrealism. Industry was also one of the main areas of focus and ground change. Gospelin was created as an organization in charge of setting productivity goals for all other industries and monitoring the progress of their work. Any worker who was deemed to be holding back the progress was detained or sent off to labor camps. Nowadays, I can't help but wonder if that's what MAID is for. Those useless eaters. Although production rate was immensely raised by thousands of %, the quality of people's life degraded, as fear of arrest was forcing the workers to labor over 14 hours a day. Paperwork was frequently falsified when an industrial unit had no hope of meeting their set output levels. In reality, people were not wholly interested in expanding the heavy industry when there was not even enough food. And their real preoccupations, such as arrests, hunger, and acquisition of goods, were never portrayed in socialist realist literature, which focused on exactly the opposite, creating the socialist hero who expands the industry and has no personal needs. Remember the dancing nurses? Or all those other images? The masked person looking up? Frontline workers? This paradox is what it's founded on. Its entire foundation is rooted in lies. This is why truth is so powerful and why Socrealism is so pervasive, but not at all reality. This is why dissidents of before and those who censor now focus so much on truth, misinformation, malinformation. The mechanization and confusion around truth is inherent to totalitarian creep as it creeps. The quote from above was from arts.brighton.ac.uk, by the way. More from Václav. If ideology was originally a bridge between the system and the individual as an individual, then the moment he steps onto this bridge, it becomes at the same time a bridge between the system and the individual as a component of the system. That is, if ideology originally facilitated by acting outwardly, the constitution of power by serving as a psychological excuse, then the moment that excuse is accepted, it constitutes power inwardly, becoming an active component of that power. It begins to function as the principal instrument of ritual communication within the system of power. The whole power structure, and we've already discussed its physical articulation, could not exist at all if there was not a certain metaphysical order binding all of its components together, interconnecting them and subordinating them to a uniform method of accountability, supplying the combined operation of all these components with rules of the game. That is, with certain regulations, limitations, and legalities. This metaphysical order is fundamental to and standard throughout the entire power structure. It integrates its communication system and makes possible the internal exchange and transfer of information and instructions. It is rather like a collection of traffic signals and directional signs, giving the process shape and structure. This metaphysical order guarantees the inner cohesion of the totalitarian power structure. It is the glue holding it together, its binding principle, the instrument of its discipline. Without this glue, the structure as a totalitarian structure would vanish. It would disintegrate into individual atoms, chaotically colliding with one another in their unregulated particular interests and inclinations. The entire pyramid of totalitarian power, deprived of the element that binds it together, would collapse in upon itself, as it were, in a kind of material implosion, end quote. We saw such an explosion a few months ago. When I wrote this a few days ago. That explosion could have gone very differently. But a literal, explosive moment was in fact an explosion of truth. And therefore, no matter how it unfolded, a threat to the system. The story of the hero in that moment became not one of the mechanized by the but one of the human, unmistakably human. Naturally, as human beings are inherently creators and naturally will respond to truth's self-evident nature, we saw a response, even within the products of industry, a rejection of the very mechanization that seemed to overtake our storytelling, storytellers, and stories. The response was as immediate as any naturally occurring one, and rooted in an older lineage than Socrealism can access, and therefore usually attempts to obliterate. This was remarkable. Let me see if I can make this larger. Remember seeing the kids mimicking? As Jordan Peterson has explained, there's a lot of information and importance in play. That play. Let's stop for a moment and compare that moment of play, that true spontaneity. James Lindsay has talked about this whole concept of spontaneity in communism, which is inherent in Socrealism. My mom used to tell me when she would perform in Romania as a kid, they would say, "Comrades, be spontaneous." It looks ridiculous. I mean, it looks a lot like this. Remember the dancing nurses? It's artifice. It's artifice. Ask yourself, remembering that image that now is almost impossible to find online. Is it true that the hero is toil, and that the toiler is unthinkable outside the collective? If you say yes, you have a very brutal and very mechanized worldview. Václav, who was in fact a playwright, by the way, wrote, quote, "As the interpretation of reality by the power structure, ideology is always subordinated ultimately to the interests of the structure. Therefore, it has a natural tendency to disengage itself from reality, to create a world of appearances, to become ritual. In societies where there is public competition for power and therefore public control of that power, there also exists, quite naturally, public control of the way that that power legitimizes itself ideologically. Consequently, in such conditions, there's always certain correctives that effectively prevent ideology from abandoning reality altogether. Under totalitarianism, however, these correctives disappear, and thus there is nothing to prevent ideology from becoming more and more removed from reality, gradually turning into what it has already become in the post-totalitarian system, a world of appearances, a mere ritual, a formalized language deprived of semantic contact with reality and transformed into a system of ritual signs that replace reality with pseudo-reality. Rather sociopathic, isn't it? So was this a ritual, void of content, an empty phrase, or was it something else? even if the system had conspired into that moment, however it may have and whatever may have been the purpose, this moment was a rejection of the system itself. It came from what Václav calls the hidden sphere. This hidden sphere rejects entirely, in a moment of truth, in a moment of living not by lies, obliterating the foundation of totalitarian unnatural order. Quote, "Yet as we have seen, ideology becomes at the same time an increasingly important component of power, a pillar providing it both excusatory legitimacy and an inner coherence. As this aspect grows in importance, as it gradually loses touch with reality, it requires a peculiar but very real strength. It becomes reality itself, albeit reality altogether self-contained. One that on certain levels, chiefly inside the power structure, one could even say chiefly inside the seemingly influencer culture, for example, or seeming media world. There's something that just, it's things that we keep remarking, or university, something that doesn't connect, it's so insular, right? There's many examples of this. May have a greater weight in there than reality as such. Increasingly, the significance of phenomena no longer derives from the phenomena themselves. Let's look at what just happened with this case at the subway. But from their locus as concepts in the ideological context. Reality does not shape theory, but rather the reverse. Thus, power gradually draws closer to ideology than it does to reality. It draws its strength from theory, including critical theory, very much so. Draws its strength from theory and becomes entirely dependent on it. This is what's happening with a lot of people, particularly with men, I think, right now, and what had happened with women. I mean, we're all consumed by it. This inevitably leads, of course, to a paradoxical result. Rather than theory, or rather ideology serving power, power begins to serve ideology. It's as though ideology had appropriated power from power, as though it had become dictator itself. It then appears that theory itself, ritual itself, ideology itself makes decisions that affect people and not the other way around. End quote. That moment, that was a person choosing something rather than the illusionary nature that is so common in totalitarian creep. The rhetorical illusion of no choices at all. This was not some empty slogan we have grown so used to in the landscape of totalitarian creep that hides behind the illusion of a dictatorship. Quote, "The automatic operation of a power structure thus dehumanized and made anonymous is a feature of the fundamental automatism of the system. It would seem that it is precisely the dictates of this automatism which select people lacking individual will for the power structure. That it is precisely the dictate of the empty phrase which summons to power people who use empty phrases as the best guarantee that the automatism of the post-totalitarian system will continue." Frankly, I think there's nothing more consumed by empty phrases than the idea of party. That moment was not some mechanized ritual. Quote, "Experience has taught us again and again and again that this automatism is far more powerful than the will of any individual. And should once someone muster or possess more independent will, he must conceal it behind a ritually anonymous mask in order to have an opportunity to enter the power hierarchy at all. And when the individual finally gains a place there and tries to make his will felt within it, that automatism, with its enormous inertia, will triumph sooner or later. And either the individual will be ejected by the power structure like a foreign organism, or he will be compelled to resign his individuality gradually, once again blending with the automatism and becoming its servant, almost indistinguishable from those who preceded him and those who will follow. It can be said, therefore, that ideology, as that instrument of internal communication which assures the power structure of inner cohesion, is in the post-totalitarian system something that transcends the physical aspects of power, something that dominates it to a considerable degree, and therefore tends to assure its continuity as well. It is one of the pillars of the system's external stability. This pillar, however, is built on a very unstable foundation. It is built on lies. It works only so long as people are willing to live within the lie. End quote. That is why truth is so powerful, and why dissidents succeeded before by rejection of any idea that any system or within it could successfully defeat it. The only way to win is to not play the game. Change it. Fight, fight, fight. Live not by lies. Quote, it can be said, therefore, that ideology as that instrument of internal communication which assures the power structure of inner cohesion is, in the post-totalitarian system, something that transcends the physical aspects of power, something that dominates it to a considerable degree and therefore tends to assure its continuity as well. It is one of the pillars of the system's external stability. This pillar, however, is built on a very unstable foundation. It is built on lies. It works only so long as people are willing to live within the lie. This hidden sphere is accessible to anyone, but denied to the regime. Quote, as long as appearance is not confronted with reality, it does not seem to be appearance. As long as living a lie is not confronted with living the truth, the perspective needed to expose its mendacity is lacking. As soon as the alternative appears, however, it threatens the very existence of appearance and living a lie in terms of what they are, both their essence and their all-inclusiveness. And at that same time, it is utterly unimportant how large a space this alternative occupies. Its power does not consist in its physical attributes, but in the light it casts on those pillars of the system and its unstable foundations. After all, the greengrocer was a threat to the system not because of any physical or actual power he had, but because his action went beyond itself, because it illuminated its surroundings. What he's referring to there in the beginning of the essay, he says, a greengrocer puts into his windows, "Workers of the world unite," and asks, why does he do it? Such as, why do people put these other empty slogans, Black Lives Matter? Why do they do it? It would be more truthful if somebody said, I am afraid and therefore obedient. And this, because every human being has dignity, this obedience must form a sort of pragmatic way to say, well, what's wrong with the workers of the world uniting? Or what's wrong with blacks saying Black Lives Matter? Or what's wrong with saying Christ is King? Or what's wrong with saying endless? They're all empty phrases. They mean nothing. They're devoid of content. They're all sociopathic, frankly, manipulative. After all, the greengrocer was a threat to the system. That's what happens when he suddenly decides not to do it. It says, because his action went beyond itself, because it illuminated its surroundings, and of course because of the incalculable consequence of that illumination. In the post-totalitarian system, therefore, living within the truth has more than a mere existential dimension, returning humanity to its inherent nature, or a noetic dimension, revealing reality as it is, or a moral dimension, setting an example for others. It has an unambiguous political dimension. If the main pillar of the system is living a lie, then it is not surprising that the fundamental threat to it is living the truth. That is why it must be more suppressed, more severely than anything else. In the post-totalitarian system, truth in the widest sense of the word has a very special import, one unknown in other contexts. In this system, truth plays a far greater and above all a far different role as a factor of power or as an outright political force. How does the power of truth operate? How does truth factor out of power as a factor of power work? How can its power as power be realized? Well, live not by lies. Fight, fight, fight. You are essential. You're a pillar of it, and you're enslaved by it. But at least you're not the first to go walking in the desert for 40 years, and you probably won't have to walk 40 years either. I think this awareness of what it really means, what liberty really means, what freedom really is, and all of that is something that has to be reminded perhaps every generation. Until, well, perhaps that's what Mashiach can do for us. Free us a little bit of that cyclical need to relearn something. But I have no idea what that would look like, because that's not my business. Only his. So, in the meantime, what story do you choose to tell? And what do you choose to do about it? And I hope this gave some insight to why I'm saying, let's get rid of this terminology of left-right, for the moral reason that the longer we go on like this, the more suffering, the more death, the more oppression. And I'm really, really tired of seeing people play it's like saying, which serial killer was worse? Who would you rather have at dinner? Or which was a less bad option for vaccination? It's when everyone's free to choose slavery, that's not freedom. So, and as for you, if Mr. Stonovich sees this, I hope you understand that you've kind of concocted a character out of yourself. I never sat and talked to you. I don't know you at all. I'm just responding to your third person kind of creation of your Stonovichness. And I'm also speaking out for, not just because James is somebody who I consider a friend, but also because somebody who I agree with him. But I disagree a bit on the linguistics. And I do think this does matter. I don't know if we can succeed in... I don't know what the answer is, but I will say, don't blame the metal for the rust. Or, if you're going to tent your house because you have termites, you don't have to burn the damn thing down. But if you are this mechanized theology, well, that's exactly what it wants. It's very dark. It's very frightening. But as somebody who experienced what it was like to just step away from it when I left New York, it's shocking how little power it actually has. But it's part of all of us. And I think the fastest way to stop this crap, though, is can we just stop playing identity politics, because it just destroys identity. And there is no real power in it. And as far as I'm concerned, anyone who keeps screaming and yelling about liberalism and the Jews or women or this, guys, just stop it. I get it. It sucks. But just stop it. Because for those men out there who are trying to support and help men and guys that have had a rough road of it, this doesn't help. It's frankly a very mean girl approach to a problem, which I think Emersonian self-reliance is a lot more effective. And I think this whole it's a little ridiculous, guys. Just totalitarian creep sucks. We don't want it. Duh. And if you're defending it and spending so much time arguing over whether or not a piece of satire was a truthful depiction of a problem, with the ideology that you've adopted and let it go. You aren't your ideology. The foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by statesmen, philosophers, and divines. Trust thyself. Maybe that's it. I'm sick and tired of seeing people say, trust me, trust thyself. Which, in mind, please read these things. And I know this went on, and I've been babbling, but that's one of the icky parts of being artful in life. There's doubt before you make something, complete skepticism when you're doing it, and then terror afterwards, because you'll never know whether something lands. But the intention is always that when you're doing something, it's the way you're attending, as Ian McGilchrist says. That's why the process is what's artful. There's some work that's worth doing that the only way to work smart is to work the process. There's no shortcuts. And that includes, again, no shortcut to enlightenment. So if anybody's kind of selling you on this idea that they took a whatever and did some ritual just imagine somebody who's Catholic using that same stuff about, taking the host. I mean, it's insane. And it also is a complete fabrication of an understanding of what rituals really are. So that's that. And for my fellow Jews, I think we have to remember that if we turn ourselves into frozen identity, there's no choice left. So let's not be God's frozen people. We have to be chosen for a task. And trust me, there's nothing to envy there. There's not. But there's something very worrisome about a system and a structure that makes pomposity and arrogance rewarded, especially among men. Come on, guys. Do better. You know you can. Please. Because we need you, This is not the time for us to be doing this, though. That's one of the reasons I'm not trying to get this out to too many more people. I'm not trying to... But... Anyway, if there's any questions or anything people want me to bring up, I'll open a space for a few minutes and see. But usually when I open a space, nobody comes. So we'll see. But I will, in case there's any questions about what I've said today. Thanks for listening. Wasn't expecting to go on so long, but I hope I made some things clear. Ciao. Live not by lies.